This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt, former President of the United States, leading an expedition along an unexplored and mysterious river in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. And let me assure you, this is not a tale of a rich man exploring in comfort like an easy safari or cruise. This is true exploration in every sense of the word. Along the way, the expedition will face starvation, murder, hostile natives, and the deadly creatures of the rainforest, all while mapping a mysterious river which nobody had ever recorded in human history. I want to note this story was relatively unknown until 2005, and many people are still unaware of the details. Candice Millard did an excellent job telling the story in her book, The River of Doubt, and that is my primary source. It is a true adventure and is one of my favourites, so I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Welcome to The Great Explorers. Theodore Roosevelt is our main character, so before we begin, I'm going to give you some background on the man. I will keep this as brief as I can, which is incredibly difficult when it comes to Roosevelt. It would be fair to say that he lived one of the fullest lives of any man that has ever walked this earth. He is an absolutely fascinating individual. But let's get started. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born in October 1858 in New York City to a wealthy family. As a child, he suffered from poor health. He was small, skinny, and constantly battled against his asthma. Often he would be unwell for weeks at a time, and doctors were convinced he would remain in this state for the rest of his life. But despite these health issues, Theodore's father was not the type of man to coddle his son. One day, after months of suffering, Theodore Sr. sat his son down and delivered a blunt challenge. Quote, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you lack the body. Without the body's strength, your mind cannot reach its full potential. You must make your body." End quote. With a strong gaze, the 12-year-old reportedly replied, "I'll make my body." From that moment, Theodore set out to transform himself. He hit the gym daily, lifted weights, scaled mountains, and plunged into icy waters. Over time, this relentless effort paid off, and he overcame his health struggles. His father, Theodore Sr., instilled energy and willpower into his son. He was hard and stern, but also fair and generous. To be cowardly or lazy was a terrible sin, and he expressed the need for the high moral traits of strength, service, and exercise. He was an excellent role model. Theodore Jr. was also a good student. He learned several languages and was interested in the natural sciences. His appetite for knowledge was enormous, and he read voraciously on any topic from anatomy to history and zoology. By the way, reading would be a habit that Roosevelt would be obsessed with his entire life. Even as president, he would read anywhere between 1 to 3 books a day, skimming through the pages with remarkable speed, but retaining all the important information. One story highlights this well. When Roosevelt was president, a friend gave him a book to read before a full evening's entertainment at the White House. Roosevelt was busy speaking with guests all night and retired to bed around 11 p.m. But the next morning, Roosevelt gave his astonished friend a full, comprehensive review of the book over breakfast. His friend would later write that between the hours of 10 p.m. and 8 a.m., quote, he read a volume of 300 odd pages and missed nothing of significance that it contained, end quote. But when Theodore Jr. was still a young man, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly in 1878 at the age of 46. Stomach cancer was the cause. This shattered the young Roosevelt's world. His father was everything to him, and it threw the young man into a deep depression. But what follows is a pattern that will stay with Roosevelt throughout his entire life. When tragedy strikes, he looks to 2 sources to regenerate himself: exercise and nature. For Roosevelt, grief is overcome by throwing himself into hard physical challenges. To deal with the pain, he rode for hours at a time, sometimes over distances of 25 miles or more. He hiked and rode and swam. He boxed and wrestled. He hunted for long hours in the forests. And eventually, his pain subsided. Following his college years, Theodore turned to a career in politics. He aligned himself with the Republicans and at age 23 secured a position in the New York State Assembly. He served several terms, earning a reputation for fighting corruption. But then personal tragedy struck again. In 1880, Roosevelt married Alice Hathaway Lee, and they had a daughter together named Alice Lee. However, 2 days after the birth, Roosevelt's mother died of typhoid, and then 11 hours later, Roosevelt's wife died of a kidney disorder. In the span of 24 hours, Roosevelt had lost both his wife and his mother. In his diary for that day, Roosevelt wrote a large X on the page and added, quote, "The light has gone out of my life," end quote. Roosevelt left his infant daughter in the care of his sister and looked for a new challenge to overcome his grief. He invested $80,000 in a ranch in the Dakota Territory and went west. Over the next few years, Roosevelt turned himself into a kind of cattle rancher. The cattle business was booming at this time, and he hoped to cash in on some of the success. But make no mistake, this was hard work that demanded long hours in difficult conditions. Roosevelt loved it. Many of the local mountain men, hunters and trappers, made fun of Theodore when he first arrived, seeing a soft boy from a rich family in New York who wore spectacles, who thought he could become a cowboy. However, Roosevelt soon earned their respect by working harder and longer than anyone. This was Roosevelt's way of healing himself. He relished physical tests of endurance. It was a way to keep busy and not wallow in self-pity. He summed it up perfectly by writing, quote, "Black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough," end quote. I love that quote. That is Theodore Roosevelt. During this time, Theodore would stay in the eye of the public by writing articles for magazines about frontier life. His time in the Dakotas taught him to love the wild lands around him, and it fueled his ideas of conservationism. But a severe winter in 1886 would devastate his cattle, wiping out over half of his investment. He headed back east to New York, again looking for a way to overcome this disaster. But his time in the Dakota Badlands had changed him. He was filled with vigor and perspective after mastering a new world. His friends and family in New York recognized a change within the young man. Roosevelt would marry Edith Kermit Carroll, and the pair would go on to have 5 children together, including raising Theodore's daughter from his first marriage. Upon returning to New York, Roosevelt eased back into the political sphere. But in 1898, the US would go to war against Spain. Theodore would form the first US Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, which became known as the famous Rough Riders. For Roosevelt, this was his chance to go to war, which he had long seen as a grand and glorious adventure. He glorified warfare, and it is something his critics will long chastise him for. Roosevelt and his Rough Riders became famous for their charge up Kettle Hill at the Battle of San Juan on July 1st, 1898. He rode at the forefront of the advance, riding back and forth, putting himself in serious danger. Roosevelt, who had been promoted to colonel during the campaign, would go on to call the battle, quote, "the great day of my life," end quote. Theodore saw war as a glorious undertaking and looked upon it with a kind of religious zeal. He felt that dying in battle would be the most noble way to perish. Roosevelt's wartime bravery thrust him into the national spotlight, and as we've seen, he brought an impressive array of strengths to the stage. He'd proven himself as an anti-corruption crusader in politics, transformed into a rugged Western adventurer, and gained valuable foreign policy expertise. Now he could add war hero to his already remarkable resume. With boundless energy and charisma, he was a true rising star. Theodore's next step was to be elected governor of New York in 1898. 2 years later, he got the nomination of vice president for McKinley's second term. They won the 1900 election, and Roosevelt was vice president. However, in September 1901, 6 months into his second term, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist in Buffalo. He died 8 days later. Theodore Roosevelt would be sworn in as the 26th President of the United States. He was only 42 years old, still the youngest person to ever serve as president. Now, I want to get moving with our story, so I'm just going to give you some quick highlights from Roosevelt's time as president, just so you can get a feel for the man. First, Roosevelt was known for taking on big business and was not afraid to break up corporations that acted like they were above the law. He aimed to destroy corruption and greed and to help the average American. Secondly, his love for the natural world would be one of his defining legacies, as he created 5 national parks that set aside over 230 million acres of public land. He fought to avoid exploitation of the environment at every turn. Third, in 1905, he successfully brokered a peace deal between Japan and Russia, who were at war. He received the Nobel Peace Prize for this achievement. After serving 2 terms, Roosevelt denied running for election again in 1908. He thought that a president should be limited to 2 terms in order to avoid dictatorship. He passed on leadership to William Howard Taft, who he had been friends with for 20 years. Roosevelt was only 50 years old and had already served 2 times as president. He was still young and possessed twice as much energy as a man half his age. He still yearned for adventure. In 1909, Roosevelt headed to Africa on the Smithsonian Roosevelt African Expedition. The goal was to explore the continent while collecting animal, plant, and insect specimens for the American Museum of Natural History. Theodore brought his 19-year-old son, named Kermit, along on the adventure, and he proved himself as a brave young man. Kermit will be very important to our story in the Amazon, so don't forget him. After returning to the United States from Africa, Roosevelt started getting frustrated at William Taft, the current president. So he jumped back into politics in 1912, competing for the Republican nomination. In an unexpected move, he started a new party, which came to be known as the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt boasted he was, quote, strong as a bull moose, end quote. That leads us to October 14th, 1912. Roosevelt was giving a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when a delusional shopkeeper named John Schrank shot him in the chest with a revolver. The bullet passed through a folded 50-page copy of the speech that was in Roosevelt's pocket, as well as penetrating his eyeglass case. The bullet went 5 inches into Theodore's chest, lodging deep in his ribcage. Now, as an avid hunter, Roosevelt correctly concluded that the bullet had not reached his lung, otherwise he would be coughing up blood and already dead. Therefore, he declined to go to hospital and instead insisted on giving his full speech. Yeah, that's right. He had just been shot in the chest and continued to give his speech while wearing a shirt covered in blood. That's Theodore Roosevelt for you. By the way, the crowd jumped on the assassin seconds after the shooting and were pretty much preparing to lynch the man. However, Roosevelt stopped them and shouted for them not to harm him. The police took him away. He started his speech by saying, quote, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. The bullet is in me now, so I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best." End quote. He went on to give the full 90-minute speech. By the way, afterwards he did go to the hospital, but the doctors concluded that it would be more dangerous to try and remove the bullet than leaving it in his chest. He carried it inside him for the rest of his life. I hope that by now you have a picture of who Theodore Roosevelt was. He was as tough as they came, and there was not a chance in hell you could outwork him. The harder things got, the more he enjoyed it. Giving up was simply never an option. The 1912 election was the end of Roosevelt's political career. He had tried against all odds, but in the end, everything was stacked against him as a third-party candidate. Before we get into the events that will take Roosevelt into the heart of the Amazon rainforest, I wanted to end the brief biography by offering you my favourite Roosevelt quote. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." End quote. That pretty much sums up Theodore Roosevelt. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. And that brings us to 1913. Roosevelt was holed up in his home in New York, licking his wounds after his public defeat. But to be honest, he was bored. He needed a challenge to forget his recent humiliation. At 54 years of age, he was still healthy and raring to go. Roosevelt's wife, Edith, knew that it would not be long before her husband was off in search of his next great adventure. She was just worried that eventually his luck would run out. It all started with a letter. Roosevelt received an invitation from an Argentinian organization called Museo Social, which was an institution devoted to progressive intellectual thought. They invited him to give 3 lectures in South America, paying him $13,000, which was quite a lot of money at the time. By the way, I'm just going to add here that I have to pronounce quite a few words and places from different languages, and that is not my forte, so if I mispronounce anything, I'm deeply sorry. Anyway, Roosevelt was interested in the topics of the lectures they proposed, but more importantly, he wanted to use the trip as an excuse to explore the mysterious South American continent. At the time, the interior of the continent was one of the greatest geographical mysteries in the world. Less was known about the interior of South America than about any other inhabited continent. It was rare for any Americans to visit a South American city at the time, never mind venturing into the dense jungles of the Amazon, which was essentially a blank spot the size of Germany on every map. Roosevelt had always been fascinated by the continent. Remember, he had wanted to be a naturalist in his youth and was regarded as quite the expert. In South America, Theodore would be able to indulge in his fascinations of exotic plants, wildlife, and geography. But there was also a very personal reason for wanting to take the trip. It would give him a chance to see his 23-year-old son, Kermit, who had been living and working in Brazil, building bridges for the Anglo-Brazil Iron Company. Kermit Roosevelt will be very important to our story. He had been living and working in South America for over a year. He had chosen to work in the continent precisely because it would be a great adventure and to impress his father. Kermit's job in Brazil was tough. He worked long hours under difficult conditions, building bridges in the remote countryside. The job was often dangerous, and just a few months prior, Kermit had narrowly avoided being killed when the bridge had collapsed while he was working on it. He had fallen 30 feet onto the hard ground below and almost been crushed by the falling bridge. He walked away from the accident with 2 broken ribs, missing teeth, and a dislocated knee. Even he admitted it had been a close call. At first, Kermit had been getting paid very little, and often went hungry at the end of the month. Now, you might think all of this is very strange. Why was the former president's son working so hard in Brazil? Well, the truth is, like his father, Kermit was searching for adventure, and Theodore encouraged the behaviour as he didn't want to coddle his children. He wanted them to understand the value of hard labour. Kermit's temperament was different to that of his father. Where Theodore was loud and outgoing, Kermit was often quiet and moody. He was a sensitive boy, and this often led to periods of brooding. But what father and son did share was fearlessness, toughness, and drive. As I mentioned earlier, Theodore had taken Kermit with him on their famous African safari a few years prior, which had been a grand adventure. Kermit had proven himself on the trip of being capable and hard-working. The young man had faced down lions, leopards, and shown courage in dangerous situations. Father and son missed each other, and so it would be great to reunite. As a side note, since working in South America, Kermit had been feeling lonely and as a result had fallen in love with a girl he hardly knew. Before leaving for Brazil, Kermit's sister had introduced a friend named Belle to the young man at their family home. The pair sparked up a friendship that quickly developed. The only communication they shared were infrequent letters, but they meant a lot to Kermit. He was even striking up the courage to propose to her through a letter, even though he had only met the girl a couple of times. I mention this because throughout the upcoming journey, Kermit is determined to get home as quickly as possible in order to see Belle. At times, it will cause him to be reckless. Anyway, with that in mind, Roosevelt began looking around for someone to sponsor a scientific expedition to the Amazon region. He turned to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The museum's president, Henry Fairfield Osborn, was a lifelong friend of Roosevelt's. The museum was thrilled with the idea of sponsoring the endeavour. Roosevelt was a beloved national figure. It would be great publicity for the museum to sponsor such an expedition. They assumed it would be a safe, leisurely journey seeing the wonders of the Amazon through the comfort of a luxury camping trip. There would be no danger, or so they thought. That brings us to Father John Augustine Zahm, a 61-year-old Catholic priest that taught chemistry and physics at Notre Dame University. He was an interesting character, a religious man who was also a fierce defender of science. He had even written a book defending evolution. Father Zahm had been to the Amazon several times, writing several books about his travels. He thought of himself as an expert on South America, but in reality he was more of an amateur. Still, Zahm had always dreamed of doing a grand tour of the Amazon. He had even met with Roosevelt back in 1908 and proposed such an expedition. However, Roosevelt had already been busy with planning his upcoming trip to Africa, so he had turned down the priest. Fast forward to 1913, and Zahm was still dreaming of his South American adventure. He was 61 years old, and so needed to go soon if he ever was. Thus, he reached out to a contact at the American Museum of Natural History, wondering if they knew someone who'd be interested in undergoing such a journey. Well, as luck would have it, the contact was scheduled to have lunch with Roosevelt the following day and invited Zahm to tag along. As noted, Roosevelt and Zahm were already aware of each other and shared a mutual respect. So when Zahm told Roosevelt of his dream Amazon expedition, the pair hit it off. Zahm was very enthusiastic, which rubbed off on Roosevelt. The priest would put together the itinerary, arrange the transport and supplies, which suited Roosevelt. The museum was happy as well, as they were confident Zahm would not put together anything too taxing for either man. Roosevelt saw the upcoming journey as, quote, a delightful holiday, end quote. Father Zahm took on the task of organising the trip, but he couldn't do it alone. Surprisingly, help came from an unexpected source. He visited the sporting goods section of Roger Peet and Company, a New York City department store, and met a clerk named Anthony Fiala. When Zam shared the expedition's plans, Fiala was eager to join. As luck would have it, Fiala wasn't just a store clerk, he'd once been an explorer himself. In 1901, he'd been a photographer on the Baldwin-Ziegler expedition, which had tried to reach the North Pole. Well, that expedition had never reached the North Pole, and the commander was fired. Fiala was promoted to captain for a second attempt. But the second expedition would not do any better. Their ship was crushed by ice, and the men spent 2 years stranded in the freezing north. While they'd been stranded, Fiala had ordered his men to stack their food and supplies on the ice for safety. But one night it cracked, and the men awoke horrified to discover half of their food and coal was gone. Only the discovery of supplies from another expedition kept the men from perishing. Once they were eventually rescued, word got out about the poor decisions Anthony Fiala had made as leader. People blamed him for the disaster, and his reputation was in tatters. Renowned British explorer Henry Fielding described the expedition as a, quote, ill-conceived, badly managed, undisciplined venture, end quote. Others called Fiala utterly incompetent. And that should have been the end of Anthony Fiala's days as an explorer. That is, until Zam's fateful meeting with Fiala in the store. The disgraced explorer, desperate for redemption and another shot, begged Zam, saying, quote, I will give anything in the world to go with you, end quote. And well, Father Zam agreed. Fiala was in the South American expedition. It's important to note that Roosevelt was relatively unaware of Fiala's history. If he had poked around in depth, he certainly would have hesitated to hire him. By the way, Anthony Fiala wasn't just given an unimportant role. He was hired to be the expedition's quartermaster, in charge of planning and organising all the items the expedition would need to bring. It was quite the job. A plan for the expedition slowly began to form. They were to start in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then travel by boat north up the length of the continent, along well-known rivers. This would give Roosevelt a chance to observe a wide range of animals and landscapes in relative comfort. In essence, it would be a sightseeing tour. Now, the American Museum of Natural History was on board with the plan, but they were still a little concerned with Roosevelt's safety. The rivers and jungles of South America were never without risks, and they were about to be responsible for a former president's safety. If the expedition did not go well, or, God forbid, something happened to Roosevelt, the museum's reputation would be damaged beyond repair. While the trip was expected to be uneventful, Roosevelt himself did not do much to help ease the museum's concerns. He repeatedly stated that he did not mind risking his life on this expedition. After being told he might encounter hostile Indians and a number of other dangers, Roosevelt replied, quote, I'm ahead of the game and can afford to take chances, end quote. The museum, however, did not want to take any chances. They set out to hire an experienced naturalist who was not only talented, but could be counted on to ensure that Roosevelt returned from the Amazon alive. The museum had the pick of the finest scientists and explorers in all of America. They would find two that fit the bill. The first was a man named George Cherry, a 48-year-old explorer and naturalist. Cherry had spent half his life collecting birds in the jungles of South America. He was lean and fit, but also refined and educated. He was not afraid to rough it in the wild and endure hardship. George Cherry is one of my favourite characters in this story. He will be indispensable for the expedition. Candice Millard spoke of the man in her book, The River of Doubt, writing, quote, If you were about to go into the Amazonian jungle, George Cherry was the man you wanted by your side, end quote. The only issue was Cherry had just returned from a long trip to South America, his 25th visit to the country. He was reluctant to go off again, having promised his wife he would stay at home for the future. However, an excellent salary, the chance to work alongside a former president, and the opportunity to explore new areas of the jungle got him on board. The second naturalist was 26-year-old Leo Miller. He was young but talented and regarded as highly capable. With these new additions, the museum could relax knowing that they had two experienced naturalists to look out for the former president. Everything would be fine, as long as the plans for the expedition did not change. That's a little bit of foreshadowing for you, by the way. Now, one of the earliest disagreements the expedition faced was a dispute over the choice of boats that would carry the men up the rivers. Apart from Father Zam, none of the men had ever been to South America, and Zam had never travelled by river himself. They were essentially clueless. And because of that, each man developed a different idea about the type of boat the expedition would need. Anthony Fiala had his own theory. He was convinced that lighter canoes, the kind used by the native peoples of North America, would be the best choice, instead of the heavy dugout variety often found in South America. So he decided to order 2 lightweight canoes built from a cedar frame. He thought these would be nimble and most importantly light. The weight was important because if the rivers became impassable at any point, the men would have to carry them through the jungle, potentially for miles. His North American canoes would only weigh 160 pounds each, so they were easily maneuverable by a few men. However, Father Zam had a very different idea. He ordered a pair of steel-hulled motorboats. While strong, these would be, as you can imagine, incredibly heavy. In Father Zam fashion, he ordered the boatmakers to provide 2 ceremonious flags, one with an R embroidered on it for Roosevelt and the other a Z after himself. Father Zam was a very pompous man. Meanwhile, the costs surrounding the expedition were starting to grow, fast. Fiala set about organising the food the men would require. Among the list were essential items like flour, chicken, dehydrated potatoes, matches and soap. But the supplies quickly spiralled to include all manner of luxuries. 30 smoking pipes, different kinds of tobacco, every type of spice and condiment you can imagine, plus 24 rolls of Challenger toilet paper. The problem was, Fiala was cognizant that the expedition was being led by a former president, so he felt like he needed to go overboard and provide everything Roosevelt could possibly need. This will be a problem, as we will soon see. The expedition would set off on October 4th, 1913, sailing from Brooklyn, New York, on the steamship the Van Dyke. Theodore's wife, Edith, came on the trip south, as well as Margaret Roosevelt, the daughter of Theodore's cousin. The 25-year-old Margaret was a favourite companion of Edith. Edith was coming on the trip so that she could spend some time with her son Kermit, but also to keep an eye on her husband. She was constantly aware that Theodore might get himself involved in something more dangerous than a simple sightseeing tour. The destination of the Van Dyke was Bahia, Brazil. From there, it would be on to Rio de Janeiro. Roosevelt would go on his speaking tour, while the rest of the men would prepare for the expedition. Zam's plan was to travel up several rivers, including the Amazon, Parana, Paraguay, and Orinoco. These were all well-known rivers. 3 days before reaching Bahia, Brazil, the steamship passed by the Amazon River, although they didn't actually see it. The Amazon River is, to be honest, insane. It is over 4,000 miles long, the second largest river in the world. Over 1/5 of the world's freshwater drainage comes from the Amazon, and the river dispels so much water that as far as 100 miles out into the Atlantic, you can taste fresh water. The river is so wide at times, you can't see the other side. It is unimaginably large. For Roosevelt, the chance to explore such a natural wonder was irresistible. This is what he lived for. On October 18th, 1913, Roosevelt and his team landed in Brazil. Thousands of Brazilians waited on the shore to greet Roosevelt, but the former president did not stay long. He took a quick tour, met the governor, and picked up his son Kermit. He wanted to get going. It was here that the former president started to question whether this trip would truly feed his hunger for adventure. Here, South America stretched before him, brimming with untapped possibilities. Yet the plan ahead seemed little more than a pleasant sightseeing jaunt. Was there anything more exciting and glorious he could achieve? And here we meet 48-year-old Colonel Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, the heroic commander of the Strategic Telegraph Commission. Rondon will play a very important role in the Roosevelt expedition. Now, all I can say to you about Rondon is that he is an absolute warrior of a man. I did not know of him before researching this story, but he is actually considered a national hero in Brazil and close to a mythical figure. Hundreds of schools, parks and hospitals are named after the man, including an entire state of Brazil called Rondonia. So who was he? Well, Rondon was probably the most famous and experienced explorer in all of Brazil. He had spent half his life exploring the Amazon and travelled over 14,000 miles of wilderness that until him had been largely unmapped. Rondon was in charge of building the nation's telegraph system, a difficult and dangerous job. Rondon had been born in the remote western Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. He was of both European and Indian descent. Both his parents would die before the age of 2 due to smallpox. He was taken in by his grandparents until they too died while he was still a boy. He was then sent to live with his uncle. Here you can already see a trend that would fit Rondon for the rest of his life. Survival against great odds, but also loneliness, and isolation. Rondon moved to Rio de Janeiro at the age of 16. The sprawling city was a completely different world compared to the remote countryside he had been raised in. He enrolled in the city's military school. Rondon was immensely poor, but he had enough willpower and discipline to make him a match for an entire regiment of men. He lived on a meagre diet of rice and beans, and worked night and day, aiming to complete his 2-year degree in just 1 year. At one point, he became so malnourished that he collapsed on his way to class. Eventually, Rondon graduated in 1888 and was promoted to military engineer, which would have given him a decent job teaching at the military headquarters. Against all odds, he had achieved a goal many would have been happy with, never mind an orphan from the edge of Brazil. But Rondon was not a normal soldier. He wanted to serve not only his country, but also the Indians, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. After all, he shared their blood. He said, quote, "I want to bring the civilization which I have acquired to my Amazonia, to the jungle and its tribes." End quote. He was determined to do it in a non-violent way. At only 25 years old, he was chosen to lead the Strategic Telegraph Commission, which would be later known as the Rondon Commission, a job that would put him in direct contact with the Amazon's most isolated tribes that were not fond of outsiders. Rondon's reputation grew quickly, and he became a legend. His expeditions into the wild jungles were infamous for their long, exhausting, lonely treks. Him and his soldiers would suffer from disease, starvation, and relentless Indian attacks. Rondon was supposed to have 150 men for his expeditions, but he rarely had a full unit. In 1900, Rondon began an expedition with 81 men. By the end of the year, only 30 were left. 17 had deserted, and the others were either hospitalized or dead. Being assigned to Rondon's unit became a punishment, reserved for men who had been proven to be lazy or violent. Many of the men were recruited directly from Rio de Janeiro's prisons. When notified of their assignment, many prisoners asked to remain in the jail. But Rondon would always survive his journeys. The men said his endurance was legendary, and he never complained about hardship. Plus, he became a legend to the native Indians of Brazil. So that is some background on Colonel Rondon. But how did he come to get involved with Roosevelt? While Theodore was trying to come up with a more adventurous trip for himself, the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs asked him if maybe he would want to explore an unknown river. And that question was the start of a whole new direction for the expedition. This piqued the ears of Roosevelt. Travelling on a known route offered no challenge or glory. Roosevelt said he wanted to do something that would, quote, "unravel the unknown aspects of our wilds," end quote. In the meantime, the Brazilian government approached Rondon and asked if he would be interested in accompanying Roosevelt as a guide. At first, the legendary explorer was not keen. He had no interest in babysitting a bunch of Americans on a river cruise. He was interested in scientific endeavours. In short, he would only go if the trip was more meaningful. In the end, Rondon proposed 5 alternative options to Father Zam's conventional route. By far the most dangerous of these 5 routes was exploring the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. Rondon said that descending the River of Doubt would, quote, "offer the greatest unforeseen difficulties," end quote. By the way, if Rondon alluded that something would be difficult, it was safe to say that that was the understatement of the century. And as you can imagine, as soon as Roosevelt heard this, he was all over it. But what was the River of Doubt? It sounds pretty scary, right? The River of Doubt was an unknown river completely unmapped. Its length and direction was anybody's guess. It could be 200 miles long, or it could be 1,000 miles long. It snaked through a dense, unexplored, tangled jungle in the heart of the Amazon. There would almost certainly be waterfalls and rapids, and that's not to mention undiscovered native tribes who had never contacted the outside world. Such native Indians were often fiercely resistant to intruders and could be deadly. This was a jungle that many explorers had perished in. In my last video on the Great Explorers channel, I detailed the journey of Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana as he travelled the Amazon River. His journey claimed the lives of many of his men, and they faced continual starvation, attack from native tribes, and disease. Orellana only just made it out of the jungle alive, and here was Roosevelt planning to follow in his footsteps. Roosevelt was set on the idea, and the Brazilian government started to become a little nervous about having played a part in suggesting this new dangerous route. The minister continually warned Roosevelt that, quote, "you must understand we cannot tell you anything of what will happen," end quote, and that there may be, quote, "some surprises not necessarily pleasant," end quote. If the Brazilian government was nervous, when news reached the American Museum of Natural History, the president, Henry Osborn, was in shock. Horrified, he sent a message to Roosevelt stating that he would, quote, not assume any responsibility for what might happen in case you do not return alive, end quote. Well, Roosevelt replied, writing, quote, tell Osborn I have already lived and enjoyed as much of life as any 9 other men I know. I have had my full share. And if it is necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I am quite ready to do so, end quote. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. The opportunity to explore an unmapped river was irresistible for Roosevelt. It would offer the chance for prestige and fame, and would be scientifically important. It was his chance to erase the painful defeat of 1912. Plus, while Roosevelt was healthy and energetic, he realized he was getting older. Regarding the new route, he wrote it was, quote, his last chance to be a boy, end quote. While Roosevelt was ready to accept the danger for himself, he would not force his men to do the same. He assured everyone on the team that they were free to leave the expedition if they wished. To his surprise, all of the men, including Father Zam, agreed to the new plan. It appears that the fears of Theodore's wife, Edith, had come to fruition after all. While the expedition got organised, Roosevelt went on his speaking tour, giving speeches in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. He then returned to Rio de Janeiro, where he prepared to head upriver to join his team in the continent's interior on the Paraguay River. As a side note here, Kermit received a letter from Belle during this time. She had accepted his proposal for marriage. Both father and son were elated at the news. However, this only fueled Kermit's desire to return home to the United States as quickly as possible. While Roosevelt was on his tour, the men moved up the Uruguay River. They would gather at the frontier town of Caramba, which was roughly 1,000 miles north of Rio de Janeiro as the crow flies. Finally, on December 12th, Roosevelt arrived on the personal gunboat of the President of Paraguay. It was there that Roosevelt met Colonel Candido Rondon in the flesh for the first time, and they spoke about their upcoming journey. By the way, Rondon had first discovered the headwaters of the River of Doubt on an expedition in 1909, which would become legendary in Brazil. In June of that year, he set off with 42 men and covered over 600 miles of unmapped territory while forging a path for his telegraph poles. Many of his men became sick and had to turn around, but Rondon persisted, despite suffering badly from malaria himself. Eventually, while hacking through the jungle, they came across a strange, twisting stream. They followed it briefly, but soon had to turn around, as they neither had the strength nor provisions to continue. That's when Rondon first christened the mysterious river as the Rio da Duvida, the River of Doubt. The return journey for the men on that expedition was horrendous. By late August, they had exhausted their supplies and were surviving on Brazil nuts and the occasional fish. Some of his men were eaten by piranhas while trying to cross a river. By the time the expedition emerged from the jungle in December 1909, they had been gone for 237 days. Those left alive were so weak, all they could do was crawl. Most of the men only wore rags, their clothes having long ago rotted away. But Rondon had covered hundreds of miles of territory and added vastly to the understanding of the region's geography. And guess what? After the ordeal, he hardly took a break before getting back to work. Anyway, Rondon and Roosevelt got to know each other over the next few days as their boat travelled on to Caramba. Both men quickly came to respect and like each other. Rondon represented the kind of man Roosevelt had admired throughout his life. Rondon was disciplined and somebody who thrived on physical challenges and hardship. He had accomplished great feats through sheer willpower. And if Rondon had any reservations about the former president and whether he would get his hands dirty with the other men, he needn't have worried. He quickly saw that Roosevelt was willing to work just as hard as anyone else. One major issue the pair had to overcome was language. Rondon didn't speak English and Roosevelt didn't speak Portuguese. They both spoke a little French, so that was the language of choice, although neither of the men were fluent. Kermit was a useful translator when he was around. By the way, the expedition was renamed to the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition in order to honour Rondon adequately. Roosevelt and Rondon were both co-commanders, meaning that not one single man was in charge, but both of them. This would lead to some interesting situations later on. On December 15th, the two men arrived at Corumba and met up with the rest of the expedition. The team included Rondon, Roosevelt, Father Zam, the quartermaster Anthony Fiala, the naturalists George Cherry and Leo Miller, and finally Kermit Roosevelt. Also joining the expedition was a group of Brazilian frontiersmen called camaradas, or comrades in English. The camaradas were hard men. They had grown up poor in the small villages surrounding the jungle. They were resourceful and immensely useful companions. They would be indispensable. The plan for the next leg of the journey was as follows. The men would travel up the Paraguay River for the next 3 weeks on board a river steamboat until they reached the frontier town of Tapurupuan, the last outpost of civilization before the wild lands. From there, they would march 400 miles across the Brazilian highlands, which consisted of great plains, barren deserts, and dense jungles, in order to reach the headwaters of the river. Then they would dispatch their boats and follow the river wherever it led. Only a handful of men in history had ever reached the headwaters of the River of Doubt and survived to tell the tale. All of those men had been led by Candido Rondon. As a note, I find the scale of the South American continent to just be enormous. The fact it was going to take 3 weeks on board the steamboat just to reach the town where they would set off from is insane to me. But perhaps that's because I live in the UK, which is comparatively tiny. Over the next few days, the expedition prepared to set off. The naturalists, Miller and Cherry, had been busy collecting all manner of specimens over the last few weeks, including jaguar skins and exotic plants, and they now boxed them up to send them back to New York. Supplies and provisions for the journey were loaded onto the steamer. This included the 2 lightweight canoes Anthony Fiala, the quartermaster, had brought down from North America. By the way, the steel-hold boats that Father Zam had ordered had been deemed too heavy and left in Rio de Janeiro. A doctor was added to the expedition's ranks, which was an absolute necessity in the wilds. To undertake such a journey without one would be suicide. Lastly, the expedition also acquired a pack of dogs that they planned to help hunt game. This was the first time the entire team was now together, so they got to know each other. Naturally, everyone was particularly curious about Roosevelt, being a former president and all. They were surprised at how warm and friendly Theodore was with every member of the team. Most were curious to see if Roosevelt would live up to his reputation for physical strength and vigour. He was, after all, now 55 years old, but it didn't take long before they got to see for themselves. On New Year's Day, 1914, Roosevelt, Kermit, and a handful of the Brazilian camaradas woke early at 5 a.m. and headed out for a jaguar hunt on the banks of the river. Anthony Fiala would never forget what he saw that day. By late afternoon, no one on the ship had seen or heard of the hunting party, but finally, one of the Brazilian camaradas came running into camp, shouting in exhaustion. He immediately fell down in a corner and went to sleep. 20 minutes later, another Brazilian officer ran in, completely spent, barely able to move. The men at the camp grew concerned with the safety of Roosevelt and his son. What if something had happened to them? The sun was starting to set, so they went out into the forest and started looking. They had only gone a short distance when they came across a clearing where a Brazilian officer was laying on the ground, unable to go any further. His clothes were torn and he was covered with dust and blood. He was utterly exhausted. They helped him back to camp and then kept searching. This is what Fiala said later, talking to a reporter about the event. Quote, "I pushed on further in and saw Colonel Roosevelt and Kermit dragging the other Brazilian officer through the jungle. I shall never forget the awesome appearance of the colonel as the falling rays of the sun streamed through the trees and lit up his dusty and begrimed features. His clothes were torn to tatters, and Kermit was in the same condition. I called out to him, 'Are you all right, Colonel?' And he replied, 'I'm bully,' and then went to camp with the used-up officer. The next day, the colonel and Kermit were walking about the camp as if nothing had happened out of the ordinary, but the Brazilians were bedbound for 2 days. The Indians regarded the colonel with awe after that trip." End quote. I love that story. We get to see a glimpse of Roosevelt, the man who relishes extreme physical tests of endurance. Even at 55, he had the endurance to match 3 men half his age. He was as tough as they came. The steamboat reached the town of Tapirapuan on January 16th, 1914, This was the end of the line for the boat, as the river got too shallow from here. Tupiro Puan was a collection of small mud-walled huts that housed the offices of the Rondon Telegraph Commission, and as soon as the expedition arrived, chaos and confusion ensued. The first problem was the pack animals. Rondon had arranged ahead of time for 100 mules and 70 pack oxen to be on hand to transport the expedition's supplies on the next leg of the journey. The problem was that the Americans had brought with them much more baggage than he had expected. Rather than explain the situation to Roosevelt, Rondon did not want to cause any embarrassment, so he scrambled to find more animals. This delayed the expedition's departure. When animals were finally sourced, they were far from tame. Even Rondon's men, who had vast experience with pack animals, struggled to control the beasts. They bucked and kicked until the luggage flew from their backs. The naturalist Leo Miller wrote that the animals were, quote, fresh from the ranges and had never known work of any kind, end quote. Kermit in particular was furious with the delays. He knew he was already going to be gone for weeks, perhaps months, and was eager to get going so he could be reunited with Belle. In a letter to his beloved, he vented, writing, quote, I had been ready to kill the whole lot and all members of the expedition, end quote. The issues with the baggage continued and was amplified by the fact that the Brazilian government had gifted 360 boxes of completely impractical items to the expedition. Sorting through everything was overwhelming. The quartermaster, Anthony Fiala, who was in charge of the supplies, struggled to manage the situation. The issue was he wanted to bring too many luxuries on what would be a very difficult journey. Also, the expedition had changed drastically compared to the original itinerary. The men were no longer going on a leisurely cruise, but traversing an unknown river where there would be rapids, waterfalls, and countless other dangers. Fiala failed to adapt to the new plan. Just so we're clear, this is what the men were facing. The first leg of the journey was to be a 400-mile trek across the Brazilian highlands. At first, they would follow a crude road that Rondon had painstakingly trodden on previous expeditions. But after a while, the road would disappear, and the men would have to blaze their own way to the headwaters of the River of Doubt. Also, you may be unfamiliar with the Brazilian highlands. I wasn't sure what that even was when researching, so let me tell you. When we talk about Brazil, you might only imagine the Amazon or thick jungles, but in fact the southeast of Brazil is covered by the Brazilian highlands, also known as the Brazilian Plateau. It is a geographical region that covers almost 2 million square miles of territory. The plateau covers half of Brazil and is enormous. The landscape in the highlands can differ dramatically. One day it can be a thick jungle, the next an arid desert. This means that the climate is unpredictable, and the men could face sweltering hot days to freezing nights. Wildlife can be very hard to find, which was a problem for the expedition, as they were relying on hunting game to supplement their rations. Anyway, in order to get things moving, Rondon and Roosevelt decided to break up the expedition. Captain Amilcar de Magalhães, a trusted and experienced officer, would take the oxen and some mules and lead the main baggage train ahead. They did this so he would have a head start, as transporting all that baggage would be slow going. Roosevelt, Rondon and the main body of the expedition would go next, riding mules, and travel along the telegraph road that had been made 5 years earlier. In addition to the core team, the expedition also had 150 camaradas working for them as porters and handlers. Most of them had been hired from the villages the steamship had passed by the last few weeks. So, at last, the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition set off into the wild. It was time to explore. After only a few days in the highlands, Roosevelt and the men got a sense of how difficult this journey was going to be. The oxen and mules were already deteriorating visibly. The open, sandy terrain of the highlands was wearing on them. The land was harsh and there was no grass to be found. Some days they did not see a single tree, and often would not find water for up to stretches of 20 miles. There had been too much luggage to waste carrying grain for the animals, so instead the beasts were simply left to wander at night in order to search for food and water. Often they found none. There were other warning signs of what was to come. The baggage train started to come across the skeletons of mules and oxen that had starved to death or been eaten on previous Rondon expeditions. This did little to comfort the men, as they watched their own animals weaken every day. Soon some of the unfortunate beasts grew too tired to keep up with the baggage train and were simply released and left to die. Conditions were made more difficult by the unpredictability of the climate. Occasionally, the bone-dry trail would be subjected to sudden, heavy downpours of rain. This turned the road into a muddy quagmire, and the animals struggled to avoid slipping and injuring themselves. Another problem was food. The lack of game that the men had been hoping to hunt meant that they had to eat into their rations earlier than they had hoped. Rondon had ordered that their midday meal be skipped completely. This meant that breakfast was served any time between 6 and 8 am, but then they did not eat again until 8 pm at the earliest. That's over 12 hours without any food, while navigating harsh terrain. All of the men struggled. Even George Cherry, who was an experienced explorer and used to difficult conditions, complained in his diary that they were all, quote, nearly famished, end quote. Meals, by the way, consisted of black beans, rice, biscuits, and coffee. Sometimes meat was obtained by killing one of the oxen, but that was rare. As the pack animals tired, they became more difficult to control. Some began to revolt, bucking over and over again until they threw off their heavy loads. Much of these supplies were simply left by the side of the road. The remaining animals and men were already carrying as much as they could. This was a chaotic situation, as no one really knew what was being left behind. Some of it would have been incredibly precious in the months ahead. The men were also showing signs of strain. Some of the camaradas deserted, turning around. 3 Brazilian officers also resigned, having lost faith in the expedition that they believed was poorly managed. These were early days, so the fact that men were already losing heart was not a good sign. One of the camaradas, a man named Julio, was a cause of concern for the officers. Julio was big, strong, and possessed a temper. One day, while working the baggage train, he viciously attacked another camarada with a knife. It was only because Captain Amilcar stepped in that he was prevented from killing the man. Julio was punished for his actions, but let me just tell you now that this is not the last you will hear of Julio. He will become a big problem in the future. But that's not to say morale was low, at least not yet. The core team of the expedition grew to know each other a little more each day, and bonded as men often do when facing difficult conditions and camping together in the wild. They rode all day side by side, shared tents at night during pounding storms, and ate together under the stars. They didn't speak a common language. Instead, around the campfire, one might have heard a mix of English, Portuguese, bad French, and broken German. They improvised with gestures and expressions when needed, but managed to communicate. Naturally, the conversation often centered on the River of Doubt. How long was the river? Where would it lead? That kind of thing. But the men also shared personal stories. They were a well-travelled and adventurous bunch, and they all tried to outshine each other with their tales. Rondon enthralled the others with reports of his expeditions through the Amazon basin. George Cherry recounted his experiences of being charged at by cavalry insurgents in Venezuela. Anthony Fiala awed the men with his memories of spending 2 years trapped in the Arctic and almost starving to death. But nobody could tell a tale like Theodore Roosevelt. He had a seemingly unending list of stories and adventures, most of them true. From his time in the wild Dakota Badlands, to the campaign in Cuba, to his year-long safari in Africa. The men never grew tired of listening to Roosevelt around the fire. Everyone, from the camaradas to Rondon, respected and liked the man. On January 25th, the men received some needed help. 3 huge all-terrain trucks rolled into camp. The trucks belonged to the Rondon Telegraph Commission and were on their way to the Utarity Telegraph Station, which was the next stop for the men, before they would turn west and head towards the River of Doubt. The trucks had treads, kind of like an early iteration of the tank. They were here to help and give some of the more exhausted team members a ride to the telegraph station. Father Zam instantly leapt at the opportunity, reserving a seat for himself and his personal assistant. By the way, most of the expedition at this point had come to dislike Father Zam. They viewed him as lazy, entitled, and unwilling to work. The situation worsened when Zam complained that the truck driver was a black man. This display of casual racism was a sure way of making an enemy of Colonel Rondon. Rondon was proud of his men and a champion of minority rights. He had been a victim of racism himself much of his life. Needless to say, this was a bad move by the priest. But don't worry, Zam's participation in the expedition will soon become an even bigger issue. In late January, the men arrived at Utarity, the remote telegraph station that was one of the last outposts before the unknown jungle. It wasn't anything more than a few simple mud huts, but the men were pleased to have a roof over their heads. Now, a few notable events occurred while at the telegraph station. Firstly, the men were greeted by tragedy. A telegram was awaiting Roosevelt's arrival and informed him that his cousin's daughter, Margaret Roosevelt, had contracted typhus on the return journey to the United States and had died. If you remember, the young woman had accompanied Roosevelt and his wife Edith to South America, and now she was dead. The news darkened the spirits of the entire camp. Secondly, the men's arrival at the telegraph station meant they got acquainted with some of the indigenous tribes that lived in the area, in particular, the Parisi Indians. The Parisi Indians had been living in the jungle when Rondon first met them years earlier. After establishing relationships with the native people, Rondon got them to give up their villages and paid them to work at and protect the telegraph station. I mention this because the Parisi Indians were friendly towards Rondon, and the Brazilian colonel had managed to successfully integrate them into a larger world. However, the Indian tribes that lived on the River of Doubt had never been contacted by outsiders and would in all likelihood be hostile. Going forward, the expedition would be at risk of attack. By the way, the all-terrain trucks would not go any further. The trail north was too crude and rough. The expedition would proceed on mules or on foot from this point onwards, making them more vulnerable to attack. Thirdly, the time had come to make some difficult decisions in regards to the makeup of the expedition. The reality was that they did not have enough supplies to be able to bring everyone on the adventure. Some people would head home from here. It was decided that a team of men would separate from the main expedition and head down a different river called the G Parana. This river was already known, so therefore it was less important. Currently, there were two naturalists in the expedition, Cherry and Miller. The issue was that only one was needed for the journey, but both did not want to miss out on the adventure of a lifetime, especially after coming this far. Roosevelt suggested they flip a coin to decide who stayed, but in the end, Miller decided to step down on his own accord and give his place to Cherry, due to the fact he was the more experienced man. This was a gracious move from Miller, who was giving up his dreams. In fact, Roosevelt felt bad for the young man, so he pledged $1,000 towards some work Miller wanted to complete in Venezuela to help lessen the blow. But Miller was not the only member to depart. It was decided that Anthony Fiala, the quartermaster, would go no further. To be honest, Roosevelt had decided that there was just too many men in the expedition. He was concerned about their food rations, considering how difficult hunting had been so far. More men meant more mouths to feed. Now, Fiala was extremely disappointed with the news, having viewed the expedition as his last chance to redeem himself from his failed Arctic explorations. In reality, he just hadn't done a great job organising the trip. The supplies were a mess, and nobody really knew exactly what they were carrying. He also didn't have any experience in the jungle. It was determined that the quartermaster would take some men and explore another river, the Papagayo, which was relatively unknown. Fiala accepted, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. In addition to the departure of Miller and Fiala, Roosevelt had at last decided that Father Zam was not cut out for the journey ahead. It was a difficult situation, as the priest had been the person to kickstart the entire expedition. The truth was, Father Zam was lazy, entitled, and did not possess any essential skills. He would only be a burden to the others. Things escalated when Zam heard that the trucks would not be going any further. He proposed that from this point forward, he should be carried on a chair, lifted on 4 poles, and carried by the camaradas. I'm not joking, that was his suggestion. As you can imagine, Rondon was incredulous at the idea. It took all his discipline to stay cool, and bluntly responded, no. Showing zero self-awareness, Zam put the nail in his own coffin by following up and stating, quote, "Indians are meant to carry priests," end quote. When Roosevelt heard of the priest's arrogance, he was furious and said, quote, "You will not commit such an affront to my dear Colonel Rondon's principles," end quote. And well, that was the end of Father Zam. He was sent back to the frontier town of Tapurupoan. The next day, Roosevelt wrote up a formal dismissal of the priest. The document said, quote, "Every member of the expedition has told me that in his opinion, it is essential to the success and well-being of the expedition that Father Zam should at once leave it and return to the settled country," end quote. Every single member of the expedition came forward to sign it. Literally everyone. Even Zam's assistant, whose fate was tied to the priest, stepped forward to sign the document. To be honest, it was a long time coming. Kermit was especially pleased, writing, quote, "Father Zam is being sent back from here. He showed himself so completely incompetent and selfish that he got on everyone's nerves, and then he tried a couple of things that made it easy to send him back," end quote. So after all those departures, the Americans remaining in the expedition were reduced to just Roosevelt, Kermit, and George Cherry. The rest were the camaradas, Rondon, and his Brazilian officers. It was time for them to get moving. Before leaving the telegraph station, Roosevelt insisted that they shed some of their luggage. The tents the Brazilian government had supplied were heavy and impractical. They left half of them behind, and going forwards, the officers would share tents. The camaradas didn't even have tents, and would pitch their hammocks in the driest spot they could find each night. Every man was ordered to cut their personal baggage in half, keeping only the sheer necessities. Kermit rid himself of everything he could go without, except a packet of letters from Bell that had been soaked through, and his books, which were heavy but considered essential. The expedition also decided to leave behind the light North American canoes Anthony Fiala had procured. The plan was to acquire dugout canoes from the locals that lived nearer the River of Doubt. This would save the men carrying Fiala's canoes for the next leg of the march. It will be a decision they soon come to regret. Finally, the team got going. So let's talk about the routine the expedition fell into. Rondon conducted his men with military precision. Every morning, the men were awoken by a sharp bugle. The officers would then enjoy breakfast, while the camaradas saddled the mules so they could get moving quickly. Before they left camp each morning, Rondon would announce how many kilometers they would ride that day. By the way, they kept track of the distances they travelled by counting the telegraph poles that they passed. There were 11 poles per kilometer, so they could easily keep track. The worst part, by far, was the rain. The downpours never ceased, and it soaked everyone and everything. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "Everything has become mouldy, except what has become rusty," end quote. The men were suffering, especially Kermit. He had been struggling with malaria for some time now, but the weather made it worse. His fever reached a high of 102 degrees, and Theodore feared for his son's safety. He was immensely proud of Kermit's work ethic and physical stamina, but he was scared that one day he would push himself too far. Roosevelt feared he had inherited a reckless streak. While the pair were in Africa on their famous safari, he recalled a time Kermit had shot a leopard that was only 6 yards away from him, after it had just mauled another one of the porters. Theodore dreaded to think what his wife, Edith, would say to him if anything befell their son. All Roosevelt could do for now was keep an eye on the young man. Kermit had joined the expedition to protect his father, but the concern was mutual. On February 8th, the expedition reached the Juana River, which was the location of another one of Rondon's remote telegraph stations. The men were relieved, as it meant they could sleep in the simple mud huts. They were hardly comfortable, filled with insects and hot, but it was better than spending another night in the rain-soaked tents. Just as had happened at the last station, bad news was waiting for the men. A telegram described how Anthony Fiala's team had almost died on their first day down the Papagayo River. The canoes had been sucked into rapids, and the men launched into the white water. Fiala had been swept downstream along with half of their food and equipment. The only reason Fiala was still alive was because he saved himself by catching a tree branch and pulling himself to the bank. This was an ominous telegraph for Roosevelt to receive. Fiala had almost died on his very first day of descending a jungle river, and one that was pretty well known. The River of Doubt was certainly going to be far more dangerous and unpredictable. The news put everybody on edge. I'll note here that Fiala did win a moral victory. After the incident, he refused to use the South American dugout canoes, blaming them for his near-death experience. In fact, he returned to the Utarity telegraph station to retrieve the North American canoes the expedition had abandoned there. This would turn out to be a great move, as to the astonishment of all the Brazilians, the North American canoes performed amazingly well, being far more agile in the water. Fiala's choice of boat had been vindicated at last, although it would be no help now to Roosevelt's expedition. Now, at this isolated outpost, the men started to sense just how cut off they were from the rest of the world. A creeping isolation settled over them, leaving them feeling stranded, and worse, they felt that they were being watched. They were now entering the land of the Nambiquaras, one of the most primitive and isolated tribes in the Amazon. Until Rondon had first encountered them 6 years earlier, the Nambiquaras had never been contacted by outsiders, ever. That's insane to think about. They had been cut off from the entire modern world for all of history. They had no concept of a president. Hell, they had no concept of the United States. They had been surviving in the harsh jungle for millennia. Rondon's first encounter with the Nambiquaras had almost been fatal. Rondon and 3 of his men had ridden towards the Indians' camp, with their mules packed full of gifts, trying to make an attempt at friendship. This is how Rondon liked to operate. He would leave gifts for the natives and then back away to give them space. He would repeat this process hundreds of times, slowly winning over their trust. But on this occasion, it went wrong. As he approached, Rondon felt something fly across his face. At first he thought it was just a bird, but then he realized it was an arrow, one that had narrowly avoided his skull. Before he could react, a second shaft thudded into his helmet, while a third slammed into his chest, embedding itself in the thick leather of his bandolier. Rondon, steadfast in his refusal to harm the natives, calmly turned his mule and rode off, a 5-foot arrow still protruding from his armor. It had been a perilously close call. The Nambikwara tribe had terrorized Rondon's men as they set up the telegraph stations in the area, attacking at night and disappearing during the day. But Rondon had stuck to his principles and refused to retaliate. Eventually he won their trust by repeatedly offering gifts, but also by playing music at night from a phonograph, sending the sound of opera into the forest. Apparently the Indians were fascinated by the music and would gather by Rondon's camp to listen to the mysterious music. Rondon found greater success with tribes like the Parisi, who were more receptive to his aid. He taught them to construct sturdier homes, cultivate more abundant crops, and offered gifts such as clothing. Some Parisi even joined his team, working for the Telegraph Commission. But the Nambikwara were different. Still largely nomadic hunter-gatherers, they settled only during the rainy season. Their shelters were flimsy and small, and they slept on the ground rather than in hammocks, a habit the neighbouring Parisi scorned them for. Clothing held little appeal for them, despite Rondon's persistent offers. The women wore virtually no clothes, and Rondon was forever worried his soldiers would attempt to fornicate with them. If they did, they would have almost certainly paid for it with their lives. Rondon now had a working relationship with the Nambikwara, but they were still immensely suspicious of outsiders. Rondon had only achieved this level of trust with the tribe, since he refused to ever be violent towards any native. And I mean ever. Rondon valued the lives of the Amazonian Indians above his own life or the lives of his men. His famous command was, quote, "Die if you must, but never kill," end quote. As you can imagine, Roosevelt didn't quite share Rondon's commitment. Of course he wanted to avoid fighting if possible, but if it came down to it, Roosevelt would not let himself, his men, or his son be sacrificed to the Indians. He would protect himself and his men with force. These concerns were realized on February 11th, when the expedition camped next to an abandoned Indian village for the night. After dinner, the men wandered over to look through the village and found the graves of 3 Brazilian soldiers who had been murdered by the Nambikwara. They had been buried vertically, with their rotting heads and shoulders sticking out of the ground. The most unsettling aspect of this discovery was that the Nambikwara, despite their capacity for violence and murder, maintained a fragile truce with Rondon. They had been exposed to the civilized world, if even just a little, and yet they were still capable of random bloodshed. But the Indians along the River of Doubt had never been contacted by the outside world, and soon Roosevelt and the expedition would be travelling through the heart of their territory with no possibility of communication. Roosevelt had every reason to think that they would be welcomed by these mysterious Indians by a volley of arrows out of the darkness of the night. Finally, in late February 1914, the men completed their overland march and reached the headwaters of the River of Doubt. They had travelled approximately 400 miles across the Brazilian highlands from the town of Tapirapuã, and the last 50 miles or so had been through thick jungle. It had already been quite the journey in and of itself, but the reality was they were only just starting. Upon reaching the headwaters, Rondon and Roosevelt took inventory of their supplies. To their dismay, they found they had far less food than anyone had realized. The poor preparation and grueling march through the highlands had taken quite the toll. Roosevelt and Rondon were about to start the most difficult leg of the journey, but they were already exhausted. They had spent a month slogging through the muddy, desolate highlands, contending with illness, constant rain, and exhaustion. By the way, the expedition now consisted of just 22 men. Roosevelt, Rondon, Kermit, Cherry, an officer called Lieutenant Lyra, who was Rondon's second in command, the doctor, and 16 camaradas. The remaining food would not even feed the 16 camaradas, who were to do the hardest jobs of paddling the boats and portaging the equipment. So upon reaching the river, Roosevelt and the rest of the officers were forced to cut their own rations in half so that the camaradas would have a chance of surviving the journey. It was now a race against time. Before we move on, let's talk about the River of Doubt for a moment. Rondon believed that the River of Doubt ultimately poured into the Madeira River. If you don't know, the Madeira River is the largest of the Amazon's tributaries. It is over 2,000 miles long and half a mile wide in places. The Madeira contributes 15% of the water volume that makes up the Amazon. It is a very, very large river. Its basin, the area where water drains, is so big it is more than twice the size of France. Based on this guess, Rondon had deployed a trusted lieutenant and some men to travel up the Madeira to the point where he calculated that he and Roosevelt would eventually emerge. The point was at the confluence of the Madeira and its biggest tributary, the Aripuana River. If Rondon was right, it would mean that the River of Doubt was over 1,000 miles long, which is as long as the Ohio or Rhine. It would be a big discovery. The flip side is that merely surviving such a long journey would be a tremendous challenge. The other fact to consider was that the team were now descending from the highlands into the Amazon basin. This meant a significant change in elevation, which on the river meant rapids and waterfalls. The current of the river in places would be exceptionally strong. If the team could go no further and needed to turn around, using boats to return upstream would be almost impossible. The best they could hope for then would be to walk out of the jungle. That would be a death sentence. In short, they must follow the river's course, wherever it may lead. At the spot where Rondon had abandoned his exploration of the River of Doubt 5 years earlier, he had built a simple bridge. Well, now Roosevelt stood on that bridge, the last marker of the known path. Everything before the expedition was now new and unknown. Roosevelt peered into the thick, dark jungle ahead of him. No doubt everyone on the team felt a stir of trepidation. The jungle felt threatening. The men heard strange noises from animals they could not identify, and every shadow pretended to be an Indian poised to attack. It was unsettling for everyone, apart from Rondon. He had spent half his life in the jungle, and it's where he felt at home. Now, Rondon had purchased a set of 7 heavy dugout canoes from the last group of local Nambiquaro Indians that he had encountered. The Indians had left the canoes tied to the bridge, which the men now found. These canoes were, not ideal. The Nambiquaro were not master craftsmen. The canoes were heavy, massive, and clumsy in the water. They were effectively a hollowed-out tree trunk and would be almost impossible to maneuver when the expedition encountered rapids. Even their buoyancy was questionable, which the men found out after loading them up with the provisions. They sat only a few inches above the waterline. Roosevelt summed up the canoes by writing, quote, "One was small, one was cranky, and 2 were old and leaky. The other 3 were good," end quote. But the biggest issue by far was the weight. They weighed 2,500 pounds each. If a section of the river was impassable and the men had to portage the canoes through the forest, the boats would be an enormous burden and would exhaust the men quickly. The risk of injury while transporting the boats was great. It would be all too easy to crush a hand or leg, and a serious injury in this environment could lead to death in a heartbeat. Just as a note in case it wasn't clear, to portage the boats means to carry them through the forest. This is a back-breaking task that will be repeated many times on this voyage. On the river, the canoes served as the men's sanctuary. Beneath the murky waters lurked caimans, anacondas, and razor-toothed piranhas. Each time a man had to wade into the depths to free or guide a canoe, he staked his life against the unseen threats below. But to be honest, the biggest animal threat the expedition would face daily was the mosquito. Malaria was rife in the jungle, and many of the men were already being affected, Kermit Roosevelt in particular. We will talk more about this later on. The final force that could spell doom for the entire expedition was time. Simple time. Every extra day the men spent on the river would only bring them closer to starvation. Hunting game in the jungle was difficult and time-consuming and would slow them further. Having to portage the canoes would reduce their progress to a snail's pace and also work the men hard, burning valuable calories. This is all to point out how one issue could easily snowball and have ramifications down the road. This brings us to a key difference between the co-commanders, Rondon and Roosevelt. Roosevelt and Kermit were both in favour of trying to move as quickly as possible. Kermit wanted to get back to civilization to see Belle, his now bride-to-be, and while Theodore wanted to enjoy the adventure, at the end of the day, he had already achieved much in his life. Big things were happening on the world stage. He wanted to return to the United States and be involved in the political discussions. The overland march had already taken longer than expected. They did not want further delays. Rondon, on the other hand, possessed a different mindset. This expedition was the culmination of 25 years of work and sacrifice in the rainforest. Rondon was very aware that the public attention that would result from the expedition with an ex-US president could secure his telegraph commission precious funding and political support. At this point, I will mention that Rondon had serious scientific intentions for this expedition. You see, it was a big part of his job. Everywhere Rondon explored, he took rigorous measurements of latitude and longitude in order to survey the regions and eventually produce detailed maps. We will get into this more later, but let's just say Rondon fully intended to carry out his work with the same rigorous attention he had always applied in the past. Eventually, this clash of thinking between Rondon and Roosevelt will make itself known, but we are not there yet. So camped at the edge of the water, the men prepared themselves to begin their journey the following day. In preparation, the camaradas lashed two of the worst canoes together in order to make a sort of raft that they hoped would be more stable for transporting the supplies. They also organised the remaining supplies, packing them in a way that they hoped would protect the contents from rain, sun and rapids. By the way, the men inspected and opened some of the food rations which Fiala had packed into crates, and what they discovered shocked them. They found whole cases of olive oil, mustard, olives, prunes and wine. While nice to have for now, these luxury items were not necessary and would not sustain the men on the journey ahead. Once again, they cursed Fiala's preparations. The issue with planning the food was that Fiala made the assumption that the expedition would be able to hunt an abundance of game in the rainforest. It would have been impossible to transport enough tins and crates to comfortably feed every man anyway, so why not just hunt dinner? But Fiala had never been to the rainforest, and his assumption was mostly incorrect. Contrary to the conception that many of us have of jungles, the ground can be surprisingly lifeless. While there is an abundance of life in a rainforest, most creatures have adapted to evade detection and are therefore very difficult to spot. Also, most of the large mammalian life, such as monkeys, live hundreds of feet in the canopy above. This means hunting sizable animals would be difficult. As they prepared to leave, Roosevelt shocked Cherry by asking him to cut his hair. The naturalist would write to his wife, expressing his shock at having just cut the hair of a former president of the United States. Finally, after everything was in place, just after noon on February 27th, 1914, Roosevelt carefully climbed into his dugout canoe and pushed away from the bank. The Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition was at last underway on the River of Doubt. The expedition navigated the river in the following order. Kermit and two of the camaradas he had befriended rowed in a canoe at the head of the pack. Rondon, Lieutenant Lyra, and two camaradas rowed in the second canoe. The homemade raft, which contained the bulk of the expedition's supplies, was then piloted by 8 camaradas. It took that many to steer the contraption. Cherry, the doctor, and the last remaining camaradas rowed with Roosevelt at the back of the convoy. With the expedition underway, Rondon instantly began to survey the river. He employed a fixed station method of surveying. This was one of the most accurate methods of mapping the land, but also the most time-consuming. It required repeated stops along the river where he would record a variety of measurements. Roosevelt was not pleased with the fixed station survey. It slowed the progress of the expedition to a snail's pace. The boats only travelled 6 miles in the first 5 hours. However, at this stage, Roosevelt decided to refrain from intervening. This was Rondon's job, his expedition, and his life's work. However, he did intend on keeping a close eye on the proceedings. If he felt progress was too slow, he would tell Rondon. Roosevelt and the camaradas quickly overtook the surveying team, and at 4 p.m. on the first day, Theodore ordered them to stop and make camp for the night. The process of making camp was as follows. The men hacked their way through the shoreline, where every inch was covered by dense trees, vines, and vegetation, and walked around 100 yards into the jungle. They would find a level patch of ground and begin clearing it with their machetes and axes, all while being attacked by all manner of insects. Eventually, they would create a small clearing and then haul up the tents and bags from the canoes. This is a process that would have to be repeated every night, day after day. By the time Rondon, Kermit, Lyra, and their camaradas appeared, everyone was filthy and exhausted after the first day on the river. The expedition's cook, a man named Franca, had managed to start a fire from sodden wood, a skill that never ceased to amaze the other men. No matter how much rain befell the ground, Franca could always summon a fire. So there they were, a tired group of men sitting around a small campfire in the pitch-black jungle. The surrounding jungle was so dark due to the thick canopy that without the fire, the men would not be able to see their hands in front of their faces. They were merely 6 miles into the descent of the river, and every man could feel their isolation. The first day had given them a sense for how hard the journey was going to be. Every waking moment would require effort, and somewhere out there were Indians. But for now, the men were too exhausted to worry. They swiftly fell asleep. The jungle at night could be deeply unsettling. While the forest in the day was relatively quiet, at night all the creatures came out to play. Strange sounds echoed throughout the trees. Howler monkeys screamed under the stars, and toucans emitted an odd, croaky yelp. Occasionally, the men would be awoken by something crashing through the undergrowth right next to the camp. It was unnerving, and the men felt extremely vulnerable to Indian attack during the hours of darkness. Every morning the expedition would follow Rondon's military routine. The men would gather in front of the Brazilian commander to hear his orders of the day. Then they would search the forest to find a suitable piece of hardwood to which they could create a marker. On it, they would paint the camp number and the date. They knew the rain, humidity, and insects would likely destroy it long before it would be discovered by anyone else, but they felt compelled to leave a record of their existence. While this may seem pointless, Rondon understood how important military ritual was for maintaining morale in these conditions. Even on Rondon's famous 1909 expedition, where all of his men had nearly starved to death, the commander had never deviated from the routine. His lieutenants had lost nearly every part of their clothing, but they still came to attention at every morning at the sound of Rondon's bugle call, despite being nearly naked. I will mention that some of the men found Rondon to be too dogmatic and stuck in his ways. He demanded as much from them as he did from himself, which was no small feat. Rising at 4 a.m. every morning, Rondon would swim in whatever pond or river was nearby before shaving. He never participated in any indulgences, no alcohol, coffee, or tobacco. In contrast, Roosevelt was much more flexible and therefore more liked. Rondon called the former president, quote, the life of the party, end quote. By the way, Theodore was fond of the Camaradas. He admired their ability to work hard, writing, quote, they were expert rivermen and men of the forest, skilled veterans in the wilderness work. They were lithe as panthers and brawny as bears. They swam like water dogs. They were equally at home with pole and paddle, axe and machete, end quote. I love how poetic Roosevelt can be in his writing. Roosevelt gave the Camaradas chocolate bars, and they loved him for it. Chocolate was a treat they would rarely ever be able to afford, so it meant a great deal. There was a stark contrast between the rugged Camaradas, Rondon's officers, and the Americans. The Camaradas were desperately poor. For clothing, they had nothing more than the shirts on their back, and most of them went barefoot. They had known a completely different world to that of Roosevelt, and even Rondon's officers. While Theodore had built up a good relationship with most of them, he knew that expeditions like this could bring out the worst in men. The Camaradas outnumbered the officers nearly 3-1. If things got bad and mutiny broke out, it would be a very dangerous situation. And while most of the Camaradas were honest and hard-working, there were a few rotten eggs. For example, Roosevelt had 3 Camaradas in his canoe, helping to paddle. 2 of them, named Luis Correa and Antonio Parisi, were friendly, generous, and regarded as among the best in the team. However, the third, a man named Julio de Lima, was the polar opposite. He was big, strong, and hot-headed. He was the Camarada who had attacked another man with a knife on the overland march. Everyone regarded him as being selfish and lazy, a dangerous man to be stranded in with the jungle, as we will see soon enough. Anyway, the expedition woke on February 28th, ready for their second day on the river. Before leaving camp, George Cherry heard some bird calls close by and went to investigate. It was worth it as he managed to collect 6 birds in total, including a red-headed woodpecker that was a great specimen for the museum. Back on the river, the men floated down the murky water mile after mile. The men were taken back by the raw beauty of the jungle, mesmerized by the complex ecosystems and how every living creature was fighting for survival every second of the day. Again, they were haunted by the unnerving sounds that emerged from deeper within. Roosevelt wrote, quote, rarely we heard strange calls from the depths of the woods, end quote. But despite the beauty of the rainforest, the near-constant rain and mosquitoes made the men miserable. The rain soaked their tents and clothes, and nothing would ever completely dry. The Amazon basin gets about 100 inches of rain a year, with March and April being the wettest months. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "Within a few days, we would all forget what it felt like to pull on a pair of dry socks." End quote. On March 1st, the canoes rounded a bend on the river, and out of the mist, a village materialized in front of them. All the men jumped up alert, as this was the first sign of human life they had encountered on the river. It dawned on them the current was propelling them towards an Indian village. Not good. However, as they came closer, they saw that the village was empty and showed no signs of activity. The expedition relaxed, but this was proof that Indians did in fact live on the banks of the River of Doubt. Rondon was excited by this discovery, but the other men were wary. They had no way of knowing whether these Indians would be hostile, but the assumption was that they probably would be. The men had no explanation for why the village had been abandoned. Perhaps the natives had moved on to better land for hunting or fishing, or perhaps they had been massacred by another tribe. In any case, the men drifted past the village, leaving its secrets behind. Two other notable events occurred later that day. George Cherry, the naturalist, managed to shoot and kill a woolly monkey, which was the first significant game to be hunted along the river. Woolly monkeys can weigh up to 9 kilograms, so everyone was pleased to at least have fresh meat for dinner. The second event was nearly a disaster. That evening, the men were busy making camp when one of the camaradas stood on a coral snake, spooking it. The man swung his axe at the snake, but it slithered away in a flash, darting straight into Roosevelt's path. Theodore reacted with lightning reflexes, slamming his boot down on the serpent, but he missed its skull, instead crushing its body. In its death throes, the snake lashed out and sunk its fangs into his heavy boots. The boots saved Theodore's life, as the fangs missed his flesh. If it had penetrated the leather, Roosevelt would have died a very painful death. The venom of the coral snake is one of the most potent in all the jungle. The poison attacks the victim's nervous system, causing excruciating pain and paralysis. Eventually, the respiratory system collapses and the victim suffocates to death within a matter of hours. In fact, the snake was considered so lethal that at the time of Roosevelt's expedition, local people did not even attempt to treat it. There was no antidote. The moment someone was bitten, he was given up for death. It was a lucky escape for Roosevelt and a reminder of how dangerous the jungle was. In a moment's notice, everything could change. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. On March 2nd, the expedition noticed the river was quickening and the current was growing in strength. This was an indication of one thing: rapids. All of the Amazon's tributaries, including the River of Doubt, originate at elevated points, either in the Andes or the Brazilian highlands, before gradually descending as they flow into the basin. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the men heard a low roar that appeared to be coming from upstream. Not before long, they were met with the first set of rapids. Luckily, they were small, and all the boats managed to navigate them easily and without incident. The men's confidence at overcoming this first obstacle, however, was short-lived. They turned a bend in the river and saw more rapids, but ones that were far more serious. White water bubbled and spat out against razor-sharp rocks. The calm and steady river they had known for the last few days had instantly been transformed. The men quickly drove the boats to the shore to assess the situation. Leaving some men to make camp on the riverbank, Rondon and his officers cut a path along the bank to scout what was ahead. Soon they returned with bad news. The rapids continued for around a mile and also featured 6 separate waterfalls, all exceeding 6 feet in height. The boats would never survive such a journey. They had no choice but to conduct the first portage of the canoes through the jungle. The portage would take 2 days. Rondon made everyone work, except for the cook Franca and a sick camarada who was sweating and shivering with a fever. The operation took tremendous effort. The heavy canoes were hauled out of the water, and the men cut down dozens of trees in order to make hundreds of 6-foot-long poles. The wooden poles were placed on the ground to act as rollers, the men pushing the canoes along them. It was exhausting, back-breaking work. The men would have deeply regretted abandoning Fiala's light canoes, but that's life. The men were fascinated by what they saw after the waterfalls. The river, which had been almost 100 yards wide, was condensed through a tiny passage that was only 2 yards wide. Roosevelt was amazed, writing, quote, "It seemed extraordinary, almost impossible, that so broad a river could in so short a space of time contract its dimensions to the width of the strangled channel through which it now poured its entire volume." End quote. This is a picture of Cherry at the narrow passage, measuring it with his rifle. The first portage ended on March 5th, as finally the men bypassed the rapids and put the canoes back in the water. But they did not get far. The next day, the men once again felt the pull of the river strengthen. They all knew what that meant, and before long, their concerns were realized. 2 waterfalls loomed upstream, along with more rapids. The expedition would have to portage the gear once again. The second portage spanned 3 exhausting days. It was frustrating for everyone. It worked on the anxiety of the men, as everyone wondered how many more rapids they would encounter and how many more times this process would be repeated. The men set up camp after clearing the rapids, but more bad news came their way. Kermit and Antonio Parisi, one of Roosevelt's paddlers, went hunting for dinner downstream. It had been a success. The men bagged a jackal, which is a turkey-like bird, and a large monkey. But on their outing, they had caught a glimpse of what lay ahead: more rapids. As excited as the men were with the food, the news of rapids deflated their spirits. The next day, on March 10th, the men made a mile of progress downriver before meeting the rapids Kermit had warned them of. This time, the prospect of another overland portage was too much for the men. The rapids seemed mild, so they elected to try and run the canoes through them. It goes to show that even at this stage, they felt desperate. The supplies and gear were unloaded and transported along the riverbank, while the canoes ran the gauntlet through the rapids. If you're wondering how the men guided the canoes through, they tied ropes to them and tried maneuvering the clumsy vessels from the riverbank. At first it went well, with 3 canoes making it through unscathed, but then the oldest and weakest canoe decided it could not go on and sank. So far, the expedition had gone 75 miles in 12 days and lost a canoe. Things were not looking good. Exhausted and hungry after a long day, the men made camp. They moored the remaining canoes to some trees at the river edge. Luckily, they decided to haul the supplies out of the dugouts instead of leaving them in. I say luckily because that night, while they slept, one of the remaining canoes that had suffered from leaks took on too much water, sank, and was swept downstream. The expedition was now down to 5 canoes. When the men awoke and made the discovery, there was panic. Roosevelt and Rondon now had to make difficult decisions. The remaining canoes did not have the capacity to transport all the men and provisions. One option was to try and walk out of the jungle on foot. This would undoubtedly result in the deaths of many, if not all of the men. The second option was to try and build a canoe themselves with limited tools. That was it. Those were the options. In the end, they elected to build a new canoe, but this would mean more wasted time. Roosevelt was conscious that a few days' delay would stretch their supplies even more. The camaradas got to work right away. They found a suitable tree and began hewing it out. Bear in mind, this new canoe would have to be big, since they had lost 2. Rondon set them a goal of 4 days, and the men worked in shifts to complete it. The Brazilian commander never left their side. Roosevelt watched the camaradas even toil by candlelight at night. Insects were a constant pain and plagued the men. The Americans wore mosquito nets over their heads, but the Brazilians had no such luxury. Roosevelt's admiration of the camaradas only deepened as he watched them work. He wrote, quote, "Looking at the way the work was done, at the goodwill, the endurance, and the bull-like strength of the camaradas, one could not but wonder at the ignorance of those who do not realize the energy and the power that are so often possessed by men of the tropics." End quote. While the canoe was being created, Theodore tried to go hunting, but came back empty-handed. This was largely due to his eyesight. Roosevelt suffered from poor vision and was reliant on his glasses. They were so important to him that he carried 10 pairs with him wherever he went. However, in the humid jungle, his glasses constantly steamed up, and the rain made it impossible for him to see. Kermit, however, had some success. He shot an 8-foot-long water snake and a large bird. At least there would be some fresh meat for the cooking pot. While the camaradas worked on the construction of the canoe, the officers took stock of their remaining rations to see how dire the situation was. Their findings were alarming. They had rations left for approximately 35 days. The officers would be able to stretch it to 50 days if needed, but it was not enough. For all they knew, they could be on the river for another month after that time. It was not a good revelation. The men's anxiety about their situation increased when Kermit was out hunting and stumbled upon an Indian trail. It was well maintained and looked as if it had been recently used. On the trail, he discovered an Indian pateran, which is a kind of sculpture made out of branches and leaves tied together. The Indians used them as a way of conveying messages to each other or as a kind of marker. Equally, the Indians may have left it as a warning to the expedition. There was now no denying it. They were not alone. The news set everyone on edge. On March 14th, the canoe was finished. It was 25 feet long, which was much larger than the others, and also enormously heavy. It took all 22 men to drag it into the river. By early afternoon, the expedition was once again travelling downstream. They were proud of their achievement and happy to be on the move. Morale was higher than it had been in days. But make no mistake, they were still desperate. On the first day back on the river, they decided to run every set of rapids they encountered. The choice was clear to everyone: risk starving to death in the jungle or move no matter the cost. The expedition narrowly avoided disaster once again when Roosevelt's canoe was suddenly caught in a whirlpool. It began to spin in the strong current and water swamped the vessel, as it only sat a few inches above the waterline at the best of times. Fortunately, George Cherry and the doctor, a man named Cajazera, reacted quickly, jumping from the sinking ship to lighten the load. Roosevelt and the camaradas managed to guide it out of danger, but it had been a close call. Losing another canoe and all of its cargo would have been disastrous. However, the next day, March 15th, the men would not be so lucky. The expedition got moving early and were paddling downstream by 7 a.m. But within a few miles, the signs of rapids appeared once again, and soon they were confronted with raging white water. It was ferocious, and they could not risk running it. They would have to make another portage. There was an island within the middle of the river, and Rondon ordered everyone to the west, or the left shore, so that they could scout ahead and plan their next move. But this is where Kermit Roosevelt made a mistake. Instead of following Rondon's orders, he wanted to check out the right side of the island, which was obstructed from his current viewpoint, to see if the water there was passable. Kermit was frustrated by the constant portages and felt the expedition was moving too slowly. If there was a way around the rapids, he wanted to find it. Kermit shared his canoe with his dog, as well as two camaradas named Joao and Simplicio. The young American ordered the paddlers to carry him to the island that lay within the rapids. The camaradas felt compelled to obey Kermit's commands. The boat headed to the island, and when they arrived, they saw that Rondon was correct. The right side of the channel was impassable too. They also noticed a small waterfall just downstream from the island. No good. So the men paddled back across the river to regroup with Rondon. But on the way back, the team got hit by a whirlpool, which made them lose control of the canoe and pushed them downstream into the path of the thundering waterfall. Kermit saw that going over the waterfall was unavoidable, so he told his two paddlers to face it head on, instead of letting the canoe tip over sideways. Amazingly, they made it to the bottom in one piece, although the canoe was filled with water. The men paddled hard to reach the shore, but then a whirlpool caught them and threw them back into the middle of the river, straight into the current heading towards a second, bigger waterfall. Joao, the camarada, jumped into the water, grabbed a rope, and tried pulling the canoe to the shore. But the current was too strong, and the boat capsized. Kermit, his dog, and the second camarada, Simplicio, were sent into the water, clinging to the capsized hull as they were carried downstream towards the second waterfall. Then, in a moment, they went over. The impact of the second waterfall crushed the boat into splinters. Kermit was alive and conscious, but struggling against the current. He lost his grip on his favourite rifle, his Winchester 405, that he had been gripping the entire time. Simplicio was nowhere to be seen, torn under by the raging current. Kermit was fighting for his life, when eventually the current carried him to a stretch of calmer water. Breathless and on the verge of drowning, he managed to grab an overhanging branch and pulled himself out of the river. You'll be pleased to know that his dog scrambled up the bank next to him, having been beside his master throughout the whole ordeal. Kermit and Joao were safe, but Simplicio was nowhere to be seen. Colonel Rondon, who had been walking along the riverbank to get a better view of the rapids, had watched them tumble over the waterfalls. When he saw Kermit was alive, he was at first relieved, I mean, losing a former president's son would have been awful. But soon his relief turned to anger. He was furious that Kermit had disobeyed his orders and almost died as a result. He sarcastically said, quote, "Well, you have had a bath, eh?" End quote. When the expedition realized that Simplicio was still missing, they launched an immediate manhunt. They searched up and down the river for a mile, but in the end would find no sign of the camarada. The man was presumed drowned. It was the first loss of life the expedition had faced. This was a tragic moment. Simplicio had been well liked, but in a flash, he was gone forever. The expedition, now numbering 21 men, set up camp and retreated to their tents and hammocks in quiet introspection. Roosevelt, while saddened at the loss of a man, was grateful that his son had been spared. He did not think he would have been able to convey such a news to his wife Edith. Theodore also resolved to keep a closer eye on Kermit and rein in his recklessness. With Kermit, it wasn't pure recklessness that was the problem, more a mix of overconfidence and a desire to keep moving, but that could be dangerous. He was also eager to work harder than anyone else, which often placed himself in the most dangerous scenarios. If you're wondering if Kermit felt any remorse for his actions, the answer is no, not really. He recounted the day's events in his diary without much emotion or regret. He did not mention that he had disobeyed Rondon's orders. George Cherry was deeply concerned by what happened that day. While he was regretful of Simplicio's death, he was more disturbed that the expedition had lost another canoe with more supplies. He wrote, quote, "The loss of a human life is always a tragedy, but the loss of the canoe and its contents was an even greater tragedy to the remaining members of our party." End quote. If they were going to survive the journey, they could not endure further losses. And by the way, while Rondon was initially angry, he quickly moved on from the death, taking it in his stride. Death was not a shock to the Brazilian colonel. He had witnessed his fair share. It came hand in hand with these expeditions. The next day, March 16th, the men awoke ready to face the river once again. On the daily camp marker, they wrote the following words, quote, "In these rapids died poor Simplicio." End quote. Roosevelt and Rondon agreed that if they survived the journey, all of Simplicio's wages would be sent to his mother. And with that, they moved on. It would not take long for the expedition to discover another set of rapids. However, they were manageable, so a full portage of the canoes would not be necessary. Instead, they unloaded all the supplies and prepared to walk them through the jungle. The canoes would be guided through the rapids in the water, with the men using ropes. This was the preferred method, unless the rapids were completely impassable. With all the men working, Rondon decided to explore the surrounding jungle, hoping to hunt some game or find some rare Brazil nuts. He took his favourite dog with him, named Lobo. Most of the men were wary of wandering alone in the jungle, especially since the discovery of the Indian village. But Rondon relished these moments of solitude and was most at ease when on his own. Making his way through the jungle, Rondon heard the call of a spider monkey, one of the largest primates in the rainforest. He creeped forward, imagining the reaction from the men if he was able to secure dinner. Well, Rondon's dog, Lobo, excited by the hunt, rushed off through the surrounding vegetation and disappeared. But moments later, there was a high-pitched yelp, and then silence. Rondon froze and braced himself for the worst. Was it a jaguar? He clutched his rifle tight. But then Rondon heard a sound that gave him chills. Human voices. He later said, quote, "These were well known to me. They were the short exclamations, energetic and repeated in a kind of chorus, with a certain cadence peculiar to Indians, who when they are ready for the fight, commence the attack on the enemy." End quote. Suddenly, Lobo reappeared, staggering towards his master with 2 arrows lodged in his side. The Indians' war cries grew louder. Rondon fired his rifle in the air as a warning, but the Indian shouts continued. He couldn't see them, but could hear their excited chattering. With no other choice, Rondon turned and fled into the forest. When he got back to camp, Rondon warned the men. They rushed to grab their rifles and braced for an attack, but the war shouts had disappeared, leaving an eerie silence in the jungle. Rondon told the men what had happened, and their faces drained of colour. There was now no denying it. The Indians were very much real and ready to attack. Rondon asked a handful of men to accompany him to the scene of the attack, but by the time they reached the spot, the Indians had vanished. They did discover items the natives had left behind, including a basket filled with animal entrails. Rondon guessed that the Indians had been out fishing before he had startled them. He left a couple of axes and beads next to the basket as gifts. Perhaps that would be enough to reassure the natives they were friendly. But what had happened to Lobo? Rondon found a blood trail that led towards their camp. Around 300 yards from the river, they found the faithful dog. He had been trying to get back to his master before he collapsed. Rondon had been very lucky. If he had walked into the ambush first, it likely would have been his body the men were now staring at. The Indians' intentions had been to kill. The final discovery that set the expedition on edge was that upon inspection, the arrows protruding from Lobo were crafted from bamboo. Rondon knew that this was not the work of the Nambiquara. This meant that the Indians on the River of Doubt were now certainly a new tribe. A tribe that had no interest in peace. Anyway, now the threat of attack was over, at least for now, the expedition regrouped at the camp. Further bad news greeted Rondon. While he had been out hunting, the team had lost another canoe. And not just any canoe, but the large one they had recently built. They had been lowering it down a small gorge by the rapids when the rope had broken and it fell onto the boulders below. One of the camaradas had almost been dragged down with it, but the others grabbed him in the nick of time. The reality of the situation was this. The loss of the new canoe left them with a total of 4, which was 3 fewer than they had originally set out with. The remaining boats were not able to carry all 21 men and the supplies. There were no suitable trees for boat building in this area. They were quickly running out of food, and they were surrounded by hostile Indians. Things did not look good. The next morning, on March 17th, the expedition discussed their options. It was clear they had to keep moving no matter what, which meant some of the men would have to walk. 8 members of the team would ride in canoes, while the remaining 13 walked. Walking along the banks of the river would involve hacking a path through the thick vegetation. It would be slow, exhausting work, and also expose the men to attack from the Indians. The loss of the canoe also meant that once again, everybody had to reduce their belongings. Anything that was not essential to their survival was left. Roosevelt summed it up by saying, quote, "We were already down as far as comfort would permit, but now we struck off much of the comfort." End quote. By this point, the team had descended around 90 miles of the river and eaten a third of their food. If the river was 1,000 miles long, which would be more than 10 times what they had already travelled, they were in big trouble. Roosevelt was suffering from a fever, so he was assigned to a canoe along with the 3 other camaradas who were battling different injuries. The doctor, Kajazira, watched over them. The one benefit for the men walking along the riverbank was that they could at least search for food as they went. Starvation was now one of the chief dangers in everyone's minds. They had not managed to catch a single fish in the river, so perhaps the forest would treat them better. The reason for the lack of fish, by the way, was that it was the rainy season, which meant the fish were dispersed over a wider area, just in case you wondered why. Because of the lack of food, they limited themselves to just 2 meals a day, and each meal consisted of less food than normal. That means they were eating less food, less often, despite the men's workload having increased by cutting through the forest. Not a good situation. The officers split some of their food with the camaradas, who were in the worst shape. The camaradas who were ever resourceful had taken to foraging for food. They scanned the jungle for beehives, but the most promising find so far had been palmito, which was the inner core of a palm tree. It didn't taste like much at all. George Cherry compared it to chewing on celery, and it didn't contain many calories, but it did fill the hole in their stomachs. Even the officers took to eating it. What the men were really after was Brazil nuts. For centuries, the Indians had survived by relying on these high-fat, high-protein nuts as a staple in their diet. In fact, on Rondon's hellish 1909 expedition, Brazil nuts had saved their lives when they had been starving. But mysteriously, the nuts were nowhere to be found along the River of Doubt. The men cast their luck. However, on March 16th, the men would get some much-needed hope. At the foot of some rapids, they discovered a 70-foot wide tributary, the largest they had come across yet. The size of it almost guaranteed that the River of Doubt was itself not just a mere tributary of the Gy Parana River, which had been one of the possible theories. It convinced everyone that this river was indeed one of great importance, and it would have a prominent position on a map of South America. It renewed the drive in the men that they were doing something important and worthwhile. They named the tributary the Rio Kermit. But even better than that, as the men camped by the tributary that night, they discovered 2 boxes of provisions that must have floated downstream when Simplicio had drowned. This was trumped by Lieutenant Lyra catching 2 fat fish, which was an occasion for celebration. The fish were the pacu species, and one of the camaradas said this was a good sign, as they never travelled up heavy rapids, meaning that the way ahead may be clear. Everyone wanted to believe him. By the way, the Brazilian government had instructed Rondon to rename the River of Doubt to the Rio Roosevelt prior to the expedition. Roosevelt was a little embarrassed by this, but he couldn't protest out of good faith. He did admit later, however, that, quote, "I had urged as strongly as possible that the name be kept as the Rio de Duvida. Myself and Kermit felt that the River of Doubt was an unusually good name." End quote. So on the expedition went, some men in the canoes, most walking. The men walking were happy to discover a small trail that ran along the river's edge. It would make their life a lot easier and lessen the risk of stepping on a snake unexpectedly. At first, they thought it was an animal trail, but soon it became obvious that this was an Indian path. On this stretch of the river, the men began to feel the Indians' presence everywhere. The dogs were alert and would sometimes run into the forest as if they had picked up a human scent. The men noticed fresh footprints in the mud and could at times even hear voices in the distance. Let's be clear, the expedition saw these signs because the Indians intended them to. For now, they had decided to let the expedition be aware of their presence. It was incredibly unnerving for everyone. On March 18th, the men rounded a bend in the river and stumbled upon an Indian fishing village that consisted of 3 huts. It appeared that the village had been abandoned only minutes before their arrival. They were being watched. I'm going to take a second to talk briefly about this native tribe. Unbeknown to the expedition, the Indians that lived on the River of Doubt were called the Sintalaga. Up until the Rondon-Roosevelt expedition, the Sintalaga had never encountered outsiders before, mostly due to the rapids that had acted as a natural barrier for millennia. The Sintalaga were so cut off from the world that when they saw the Roosevelt expedition, they did not even know if they were human. By that point, most of the men had grown bushy beards, and the Indians, like all native Amazonians, grew little facial or body hair. They thought the white men could be ghosts or demons. They didn't understand the clothes they wore, and even the canoes were incomprehensible to them, as the tribe had not yet conceived of boats. But make no mistake, the Sintalaga were masters of surviving in the jungle. They could move through the forest silently and quickly. Since they wore no clothes, they never snagged on branches or thorns. They had their own marked trails that an outsider would never notice. And while the jungle seemed empty of game to the expedition, the Sintalaga saw game and food everywhere they turned. The Sintalaga lived in small villages, usually containing only 3 huts. The village would usually house 3 to 5 families. Each village was autonomous from the larger tribe and had their own chief, although the chief was relatively powerless, more used as a figurehead for ceremonies, and each family basically had control of themselves. The fact that the villages were so decentralized is what likely kept the expedition alive. There was no coordinated attack, so each village seemed content to just watch the strange men, as long as they passed through quickly. The visible signs they left for Roosevelt and his men to see were their way of saying, "Hurry along now." It was a very good thing for the expedition that the Sintalaga seemed content to merely observe. That's because they were no strangers to war. If disease wiped out members of a village and the population needed to be replaced, or they needed to steal a woman or child, they would often attack their neighbours. While their weaponry was primitive compared to the rifles of the expedition, the Indians were incredibly skilled with the bow and arrow. Their arrows were 5 foot in length and razor sharp. They could penetrate a man's body and exit the other side. As a note here, I want to shout out Candice Millard, author of The River of Doubt, for conducting so much research into the Sintalaga. She even went to the Amazon herself to speak with members of the tribe in order to gain a full understanding of their customs and oral tradition. She did really great work and brought the Sintalaga to life. Anyways, after moving on from the abandoned village, the men quickly came to another tributary. Rondon and Lyra began to make preparations to study it, but Roosevelt stopped them. The former president insisted that they keep moving. Rondon was reluctant, but in the end gave in to Theodore's wishes. This is an example that highlights how Roosevelt and Rondon's relationship was beginning to show signs of strain. Roosevelt wanted to complete the journey as quickly as possible to lessen the risk of starving to death, and as always, Rondon wanted to do his work properly. Let's not forget that the men were working hard, long days with little food, and they were under constant threat of attack, which worked on their nerves. They had no idea how much further they might have to go. It's only natural there would be moments of frustration and disagreement. After making camp for the night at the foot of a short stretch of rapids, the men finally found the right trees for boat building. Nobody was keen on the idea of lingering for several days so close to an Indian village, but they really had no choice. Walking was far too slow. Besides, they didn't know if they'd get the chance again in the future. So while nobody was happy about it, they set about their work. The plan was to build 2 new canoes. As the camaradas chopped trees, an officer made a sickening discovery. 15 boxes of the emergency rations had disappeared. The suspected thief was the troublesome camarada called Julio. The man was known as a nuisance and by far the laziest member of the team. He complained constantly and refused to work with the other camaradas. He couldn't even be trusted to go out and gather nuts or cut palms, because if he found food, he would just eat it himself instead of sharing it with the other men. But while everyone had their suspicions about Julio, nobody had any proof, so all they could do was keep a close eye on him. The next day, Roosevelt grew more frustrated with Rondon when he found out that the Brazilian commander had been slowing the construction of the canoes on purpose in order to give himself time to explore and survey the new tributary. It stung even more because the Americans, such as Kermit and Cherry, had been helping the camaradas in order to quicken the process as much as possible. Roosevelt was infuriated at Rondon's behavior, but fought to keep his cool. The last thing the expedition needed was a break between the Brazilians and Americans. So calm heads prevailed, and on the 22nd of March, the new boats were launched. But sensing the expedition's weakness, the River of Doubt decided to test the men further. After travelling only 6 miles, they reached a series of rapids. They were so long, it took 6 hours to get around them. The whole day had passed, and once again, they had little to show for it. George Cherry wrote in his diary, quote, "Our position every day grows more serious," end quote. That evening, Roosevelt asked Rondon to step into his tent. Up to this point, the American had deferred to the Brazilian in most areas relating to the expedition, but now he had had enough. He urged Rondon to abandon the surveying work, arguing that their mission was to descend the river and survive. That would be enough. Rondon listened and, to his credit, agreed. He was not happy, as he prided himself on the meticulous details of his surveying, but he agreed to a far quicker, cursory method that would keep the men moving. Roosevelt breathed a sigh of relief. Now, while the lack of food was plaguing the men, many of them were becoming sick. The main culprit was malaria, which is transmitted by mosquitoes. A man afflicted with the disease would at first experience a deep chill throughout his body a week or 2 after the initial transmission. This chill would intensify, causing violent shaking as his body tried to warm itself. Then, the opposite would occur. A fever could spike to 106 degrees Fahrenheit or 41 degrees Celsius, leaving him drenched in sweat. If left untreated, it could lead to death. Kermit Roosevelt was well acquainted with the disease. He had first contracted malaria as a child and regularly suffered bouts of the illness. Throughout the entirety of the expedition, he battled a near constant fever. But Kermit was young, and he managed to keep going. His father, on the other hand, was starting to suffer as well. Theodore had been fine on the overland march of the journey, but since they had taken to the river, his health had slowly begun to deteriorate. The River of Doubt was a terrible place to be sick. The men worked non-stop, wearing themselves out in the scorching heat and sweating heavily. Then, without warning, rain would pour down, soaking them and leaving them shivering. The human body was constantly trying to adjust its temperature, which when you're ill is not ideal. The expedition's doctor, Kajazira, worked tirelessly to try and protect the men, but really there was not much he could do. He had one effective drug with him, quinine, which can be used to treat malaria. He was administering 0.5 gram of quinine each day to all the men, but it wasn't enough. For quinine to be truly effective, he would have needed to up the frequency of doses. But the drug has toxic side effects at higher doses, such as ringing in the ears and even deafness, so the doctor was wary of overdoing it. So, as the men fought the effects of disease, hunger and exhaustion, arguments began to flare. Kermit summed up the situation well, writing, quote, "When men are off in the wilds, they show themselves as they really are. A man may be a pleasant companion when you always meet him clad in dry clothes and certain of meals at regular intervals, but the same cheery individual may seem a different person when you are both on half rations, eaten cold, and had been drenched for 3 days." End quote. Theodore believed that one should be able to endure discomfort without complaint, and that to fail to do so revealed a shallowness of character. He had raised his children to never be greedy or lazy out on camping trips, and here on the River of Doubt, Theodore was immensely proud of his son. Kermit had worked as hard as any of the camaradas and spent so much time in the water that his boots had begun to rot off of his feet. One Brazilian, Lieutenant Lyra, who was Rondone's right-hand man, kept up with Kermit, and the pair had developed a deep respect and friendship with each other. The expedition had come to rely on the two-man team. They were both covered in bruises and festering insect bites, their clothes rotted away and with wild beards, but they both refused to ever stop or complain. And despite their differences in leadership, the admiration shared between Rondone and Roosevelt still held. Theodore noted that no one worked harder than Rondone to organize and keep the expedition on track. And meanwhile, Rondone praised Roosevelt's devotion to his work. Quote, "He wrote every day, never neglecting his literary work, even when heroic effort was required, in the days after he had been weakened by fever." End quote. Despite his privileged background, Roosevelt mucked in with all the other men, even with the most basic of chores. One day, George Cherry was astounded to discover the ex-president had washed his clothes for him and hung them up to dry without being asked. The naturalist would later call Theodore the best camp companion he ever had, high praise coming from such an experienced explorer as Cherry. Commenting on the laundry incident, Cherry wrote in his diary, quote, "It is the only time I've ever had my clothes washed by an ex-president of the United States." End quote. Cherry and Roosevelt's friendship would grow stronger the more they endured. The pair enjoyed long conversations as they floated downstream and sat beside the campfire. The discussions ranged from the American Civil War to man's duty to his wife and children, to obscure facts about rare birds. On this journey, George Cherry got to know Theodore Roosevelt as well as any man alive ever had. Despite the goodwill shared by most of the men, the troublesome camarada named Julio had earned a bad reputation. They had already suspected him of stealing food, but one night the expedition finally got solid proof. The unspoken leader of the camaradas was a man named Paychon. Paychon was universally liked by everyone due to his work ethic, discipline, and great strength of character. He was one of Rondone's most trusted and capable men, who had survived previous expeditions with the Brazilian colonel. Paychon withheld the same high standards that Rondone did. Well, that evening, Paychon discovered Julio stealing from the expedition's rations. Shocked and angry, Paychon punched Julio clean in the mouth. Julio immediately ran to Roosevelt and Rondone, crying as if he had been the one who had been wronged. Well, after a quick investigation, it was concluded that Julio was guilty of his crime. It was a difficult moment. To be honest, Roosevelt was in favour of shooting the man on the spot, writing, quote, "On such an expedition, the theft of food comes next to murder as a crime and should by rights be punished as such." End quote. You may think this is a strong view, but don't forget, honesty and integrity was everything to Roosevelt. Rondone was slightly less bloodthirsty, but only just. The trouble was, there was nothing they could really do. They could abandon Julio in the jungle, but that would mean his certain death. And besides, they needed every strong man they could get. They couldn't injure him or lock him up, as that would only be a burden for everyone. So it was decided that they would just keep a very close eye on Julio and make sure he stayed away from the supplies. On March 23rd, the men heard a distant roar that haunted them all day. But on the morning of the 24th, the sound had disappeared. They were hopeful that they had just been hearing things, but no one really believed it. By the afternoon, their fears were realized, and before them stretched a savage set of rapids. But not just any rapids, by far the worst they had yet encountered on the river. Over the next 4 days, the expedition had to constantly stop and portage the gear downstream. One of the reasons why the rapids were worse here was that it hadn't rained in 5 days. That meant the water level had dropped, and more boulders were exposed. As a note here, the expedition had travelled only around 100 miles down the river. On March 27th, the men were busy running the empty canoes through the rapids, when very quickly, things went wrong. The camaradas were trying to guide one of the rafts through a narrow channel. When I say raft, I mean 2 canoes that had been tied together to carry supplies. But the strong current jammed the vessel against some boulders. Water started swamping the canoes, but they were pinned in place for now. 3 of the camaradas and George Cherry tried to free the boat, but the current was too strong. Cherry alerted the rest of the expedition, and all the men ran to help. Losing 2 canoes would be a disaster. Well, Roosevelt was the first man there. He jumped into the water without hesitation. Cherry later wrote that this was entirely characteristic of Theodore, who, quote, could not stand idly watching others at a time when action was required, end quote. Cherry also noted that he did this, quote, after many days of suffering from fever, which had weakened his vitality, end quote. The men fought to free the trapped canoes, but the current was treacherous. It was then that Roosevelt slipped, hitting his right shin against a razor-sharp rock. Blood poured from the wound, mixing with the dark, muddy water. Theodore pulled himself to shore and limped back to camp without a word. Only he knew how bad this injury could be for him. You see, 12 years earlier, Roosevelt had been involved in a trolley accident. A trolley, by the way, was like an early version of the car. His left leg had been crushed, and at one point the doctors thought they might have to amputate it. In the end, it had recovered, and for the most part was fine by the time of the expedition. But any injury to the area brought on major swelling and inflammation. Another concern was that the open wound had been soaked in the river water, which was full of bacteria and parasites. In the end, the men managed to recover the 2 canoes and get past the rapids. They made camp early due to heavy rains, and the mood among the team was dreary. They all knew there was more rapids to come the following day. The doctor Kajazira began treating Roosevelt's leg. But the next morning on the 28th of March, the men awoke to find Roosevelt in a bad way. Despite it only having been one night, the wound on his leg showed signs of infection, and his temperature had shot through the roof as he battled a bout of malaria. The sudden transformation of the former president's health disturbed everyone. He was hardly able to rise from his cot. And if that wasn't distressing enough, Kermit reported more bad news. He had scouted the river ahead for about a mile and found a gorge through which the river flowed and contained a series of 6 waterfalls, each more treacherous than the last. The final one was over 30 feet high. There was just no way the boats could make it. This meant they would have to portage everything, including the heavy canoes. Even if it all went well, it would take days. However, when the men looked a second time, they found that the sides of the gorge were carved from a fine-grained, slippery stone. It would be impossible to carry the boats over such an obstacle. They had reached an insurmountable barrier. Rondon gathered the men at the camp and broke the news in a matter-of-fact tone, void of any emotion. He said, and I quote, "We shall have to abandon our canoes and every man fight for himself through the forest." End quote. George Cherry was in disbelief. His experience in the jungles of South America told him this was a death sentence. Getting lost in the jungle was one of the worst fates imaginable. If this was bad news for the healthy men, for Theodore Roosevelt, it was worse. There was simply no way he would make it out by walking. This brings us to one of Roosevelt's core beliefs. We know that Theodore was a larger-than-life character, overwhelmingly positive and energetic. He believed in heroic actions and doing the right thing. He absolutely detested cowardice and self-pity. His father had instilled these values into him at a young age. Well, as a cowboy, hunter, and soldier, Roosevelt believed in the law of the wilderness, that one man should never endanger the lives of others. If it came down to it, the noble action would be to sacrifice oneself in order to save others. Slowing down the other men or using up valuable resources would be dishonorable. Now, that's not to say that Roosevelt would simply give up. He would push himself until his body no longer allowed him to. He wrote, quote, "It is a man's duty to go forward, if necessary on all fours, until he drops." End quote. Theodore would fight till the end. He had embodied this belief over and over again. He had been shot in the chest by a would-be assassin, only to insist on giving his planned speech, with the bullet lodged in his flesh. He was a tough man who had endured much pain during his life. But did he fear death? No. He had been prepared to die as a soldier. If it was for a great cause, a just death was something to be proud of. President William Taft, who knew Roosevelt well, said this of the man, quote, "He has the spirit of the old berserkers." End quote. So the former president lay in the soaked jungle camp, his body aching and fever raging. He could hardly sit up, never mind walk. Concern was written on the face of everyone that looked at him. Even then, they were doing their best to help him, instead of preparing to move on. Roosevelt would not slow them down. He would not allow it. Now, in case he ever found himself in such a predicament, Theodore Roosevelt always carried a secret provision with him on these kinds of adventures. Before he had left New York, he had packed a small vial of morphine that contained a lethal dose. Roosevelt knew that his son Kermit would never abandon him. The vial represented his chance to avoid becoming a dangerous burden, to make the difficult choice on behalf of the other men who loved him dearly. Candace Millard in The River of Doubt wrote, quote, "This was not about suicide. This was about doing the right thing." End quote. That night, after the other men had gone to bed, Kermit and George Cherry took turns watching over Roosevelt. His condition was worsening with every hour. Cherry had become a great friend to Theodore, and he would not leave his side. They all knew it was going to be a difficult night. Well, just before sunrise, Cherry was woken by Roosevelt calling for him in a weak voice. The naturalist stood over the former president, along with Kermit. He addressed them both, saying, quote, "Boys, I realize that some of us are not going to finish this journey. Cherry, I want you and Kermit to go on. You can get out. I will stop here." End quote. There was not a shred of pity in his voice. Roosevelt did not kid himself when things were bad, and as he lay there with a spreading infection and afflicted by malaria, he knew his time had come, and he was okay with that. The thing is, Roosevelt had once been President of the United States. He was used to everyone following his orders, and that included his son, Kermit. But Kermit loved his father with all his heart. He was his idol, his role model. Although father and son were different, Kermit was often quiet and thoughtful, whereas Theodore was loud and boisterous. They shared a deep connection. Theodore had raised Kermit to relish challenges and encouraged intellectual curiosity. Whatever his father wanted, Kermit would deliver. That's how it had always been. But while standing in that tent, amid the sound of the rain and the lonely wails of howler monkeys echoing throughout the nighttime forest, Kermit made a decision. For the first time in his life, he would disobey his father. The young Roosevelt told his father that he would not honor his wish, that he was going to help get him out of the jungle, no matter the cost. For the first time, Kermit took the mantle of leadership away from his father and asked him to trust him. At first, Theodore protested, but soon he recognized the determination on his son's face. He would later recall the moment, writing, quote, "It came to me, and I saw that if I did end it, that would only make it more sure that Kermit would not get out, for I knew he would not abandon me, but would insist on bringing my body out too. That, of course, would have been impossible. I knew his determination, so there was only one thing for me to do, and that was to come out myself." End quote. What a great moment that is. The courageous Theodore Roosevelt willing to sacrifice himself for the others, only to be stopped by his son who refused to give up on his father. Just amazing stuff. So the next morning, the expedition awoke, still trapped by the impassable gorge. None of the men knew the decisions of life and death that had been made in Roosevelt's tent while they had slept. But Theodore had decided to live and trust in his son. Kermit was going to have to help his father move, even if that meant carrying him. However, the biggest problem for now was the gorge. But characteristically, Kermit was sure that he could find a way to get the canoes past the obstacle. Remember, Kermit had been building bridges in Brazil previously, so he had experience with this kind of thing. While the others thought it was impossible, Kermit was able to convince Cherry and then Lieutenant Lyra, Rondon's right-hand man. Rondon believed it was a lost cause, but seeing the determination emanating from the three men swayed him into letting them try. What else could they do anyway? Kermit's plan was to empty the canoes and lower them down 6 waterfalls, one by one, using ropes. Meanwhile, the camarades would transport the baggage over the steep cliffs. To do so, they had to reduce the weight of their supplies even more. There was hardly anything left anyway, as they had already dispensed with almost every luxury, but now they had to be even more ruthless. Roosevelt kept only 2 bags. One contained cartridges for his rifle and mosquito nets, the other contained 1 set of clothes. He gave his shoes to Kermit, as his son's feet were now exposed, as his boots had finally disintegrated. Anyway, Lyra and Kermit began the operation. They had done this many times, but the trouble here was how steep the canyon walls were. They could easily slip and be pulled into the raging waterfalls to be crushed amongst the boulders. At times, they were standing on ledges so small that it looked like they were defying gravity. Meanwhile, the slipperiness of the walls meant that camaradas couldn't walk down them with the baggage, so they had to carve a trail over 300 feet long through the thick jungle, the longest portage they had made so far. The undertaking would take 4 days. For the most part, everything went well, and most of the men couldn't believe that they had managed it. The only hiccup had been on the 3rd day, when a rope had broken, sending one canoe onto the boulders, which was then smashed to pieces. Luckily, no one had been hurt or killed. But the men were absolutely exhausted by the ordeal. Many of them were sick with malaria. Roosevelt spent the majority of the time laid up shivering, his fever refusing to break. When he had to move, he was helped over the hills by George Cherry. Roosevelt refused to be carried. At last, they had traversed the obstacle and were ready to return to the river. Although the supplies took up much of the space on the remaining canoes, meaning that nearly all the men had to walk. They didn't get far anyway. After only 2 miles, they reached another canyon with more rapids. The men were crushed. How long could they keep this up? Cherry wrote with despair, quote, "Instead of getting out of the hills, we are deeper among them." End quote. The expedition was at breaking point. By now, they had been fighting rapids for over a month straight. Every time they thought they had surmounted them, more appeared on the horizon. They estimated they had only made a measly 68 miles of progress since the first of the rapids, and descended around 500 feet in elevation. It was very possible that the rapids would continue for as long as that again. Food was low, and the men were mentally and physically at their limit. Most thought they were doomed and would starve to death alone in the jungle. Or perhaps the Indians would change their mind and pick them off slowly one by one. That threat was ever present. Roosevelt sensed that the camaradas were losing spirit. From the start of the expedition, he had been worried as to what might happen if they decided to mutiny. For the last few months, he had spent time with them and earned their loyalty by showing thoughtfulness towards them. Well, now he decided to share his own small amount of rations with them. When Kermit and Cherry found out, they urged him to stop, but he simply replied, quote, "I can't do anything to help, and they need the food." End quote. Even Rondon, who was usually stoic about the condition of his soldiers, admitted that the rapids were causing, quote, "considerable suffering to our men." End quote. In an ominous and foreshadowing passage, Roosevelt wrote, quote, "Under such conditions, whatever is evil in men's natures comes to the front." End quote. On April 3rd, the men prepared for another hard day of running the canoes through the second canyon. Disaster struck almost immediately when the camaradas lost control of a canoe and could do nothing but watch horrified as it was swept into the rapids and broken into 1,000 pieces. That meant the expedition was once again left with just 4 canoes, 2 of which they had built themselves. Morale was at an all-time low. And as fate would have it, another disaster awaited them that day. As the men worked to get past the gorge, they were essentially split into 3 groups at different points along the river. Lyra and some men were at the bottom of the canyon by the river's edge, hacking away at the undergrowth to clear the way for the canoes. Meanwhile, Rondon and a small team were higher up along the cliffs, carving a trail through the jungle. And finally, Roosevelt, Kermit and Cherry were with the last of the camaradas at a temporary camp about halfway up the canyon. They were tasked with transporting the baggage. While the expedition was split, one man, named Pedrino, had stayed at the previous night's camp in order to guard the supplies. While he was there, he found another camarada stealing food. Guess who it was? Julio. I have mentioned Julio before, and this was now the second time he had been actively caught stealing food. This time, he had been caught red-handed with dried meat, which was a precious commodity for everyone. Well, Pedrino immediately reported the theft to Paixón, the leader of the camaradas. Paixón was enraged to hear of Julio's behavior. We don't know exactly what happened between the 2 men, but it's safe to say Paixón gave him a very stern talking to, before ordering Julio back to work in the baggage train. Now at the temporary camp, Roosevelt and some of the other men were taking a moment's rest. Soon, Julio would appear, groaning under the weight of the luggage he was carrying, and muttering to himself. He then walked over to a stack of rifles, picked one up, and marched off. George Cherry noticed this, but didn't think much of it. It wasn't uncommon for the men to grab a rifle if they had seen some game nearby. If anything, he hoped Julio would secure them some dinner. A few minutes later, the sound of a rifle being fired echoed throughout the forest. Roosevelt, Kermit, and Cherry began to wonder what Julio had shot, excited at the prospect of fresh meat. And that's when a camarada rushed into the camp, out of breath and in shock, saying Julio had shot and killed Paishon. The Americans grabbed their rifles and took cover. They waited, fully expecting to hear rifle shots pepper their camp. Julio had finally snapped, and they were sure he was hell-bent on killing as many of them as possible. Minutes passed, but there was no sign of the man. It then hit them that Julio was probably making his way to the original camp above the rapids to kill Pedrino, who was still alone guarding the supplies. Roosevelt, who could still hardly walk, worked himself up into a rage. One innocent man had just been killed, and the life of another was at risk. No matter how he felt, it was time to act. To Kermit and Cherry's alarm, Roosevelt stomped over to the rifles and picked one up, telling the others to stay and guard the baggage. He disappeared into the forest in Julio's direction, completely uncaring as to the risk to himself. The doctor, Kajazira, raced after him with a revolver in hand. Cherry later wrote, quote, "Without hesitation, he himself chose to go back over a trail on which the murderer might be concealed." End quote. Roosevelt and the doctor didn't get far. They found the body of Paishon lying face down in the mud. He had been shot in the heart and dropped dead on the spot. Roosevelt was practically foaming at the mouth with rage, and they continued onto the camp, which Pedrino was guarding alone. As they prepared to enter, the doctor nobly stepped in front of Roosevelt with his revolver, saying, quote, "My eyes are better than yours, Colonel. I'll point him out to you," end quote, in order to protect the former president. Thankfully, they would find Pedrino unharmed, and Julio nowhere to be seen. They surmised that Julio must be hiding in the jungle off the trail, near to where he had committed the murder. When the news reached Rondon by the river, he was distraught. He had watched many men die on his expeditions over the last 20 years, but never had one been murdered by a fellow camarada. Paishon had been one of his best soldiers and a leader. The death was utterly senseless, and Rondon was beside himself with rage. The expedition launched a manhunt to find Julio, but he had disappeared into the forest. It was presumed that Julio had panicked after the murder and fled. They did, however, find his rifle, which he had dropped while running through the forest. This put everyone at ease, as it meant they didn't have to worry about the rogue camarada storming into camp, firing wildly at any time. Roosevelt was adamant that Julio needed to be tracked, arrested, and executed for his crime, saying, quote, "He who kills must die," end quote. But like always, Rondon had cooled down and thought rationally. He had to think of the welfare of the wider expedition. They could not afford to waste time and resources searching for the man. He also argued that if they did find him, they should apply the laws of the Brazilian government, not their own laws. This would mean arresting him and transporting him back to civilization to be put on trial. Roosevelt thought this was foolish. Having to guard a dangerous man at all times and give him precious rations was pointless. Better to be done with it there and then. The camaradas were deeply saddened by the loss of Paishon. They dug a grave for their fallen comrade on the spot that he had been killed, using knives, axes, and even their hands, as they had long abandoned any shovels they once carried. They pointed his head towards the mountains and his feet towards the river. Then they placed a crude cross on the grave and fired a volley in his honor. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "Then we left him forever, under the great trees, besides the lonely river," end quote. The expedition moved on. Now, the men still had to work to get over the current rapids, which meant the group would be split up like before. And even though they had retrieved Julio's gun, they had to be alert. Julio had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. He was out there somewhere in the forest. By the way, being lost in the jungle alone would have been an absolutely terrifying and awful way to die. Julio would likely starve to death slowly or get killed by the Indians. So this meant he would be desperate. The expedition placed guards over the canyon to make sure Julio didn't return and try to steal a rifle or sabotage their canoes. They placed a man at the top of the gorge to make sure Julio didn't try and push boulders on them from above. They couldn't take any chances. That evening, the health of Roosevelt deteriorated again. The outrage he had felt at the killing had temporarily imbued him with energy, but now his body crashed. The men noted how his chest heaved and he struggled to breathe while simply walking. He had to sit every few steps and get his breath. The seemingly indestructible version of Roosevelt they had first met at the start of the expedition was long gone. It shocked everyone, particularly Kermit, who had never seen his father in such a state. George Cherry, who looked at Theodore much like a brother now, was as determined to bring his friend out of the jungle as he was to survive himself. But as time went on, it looked unlikely. The naturalist wrote, quote, "There were a many good days, a good many mornings, when I looked at Colonel Roosevelt and said to myself, he won't be with us tonight." End quote. That gives you an indication of how bad it was. On April 4th, Roosevelt began to shiver uncontrollably. Dr. Kajazira took his temperature and found that it was surging to 103 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. Soon he became delirious. The doctor began injecting quinine directly into his abdomen every 6 hours, but it had little effect on the fever. Theodore's body was giving in. That night, Cherry, Kermit, and the doctor watched over him in shifts. At times, Roosevelt would mumble lines from obscure poems in his hallucinations. At 2 a.m., Rondon relieved the doctor and told him to get some rest. Theodore would then have a moment of lucidity, and he asked Rondon to promise him that if he fell into a coma, that his co-commander would do the right thing for the expedition and move on. As the sun rose on April 5th, Roosevelt's fever finally broke. Everyone was relieved, but they realized how close to death the ex-president had come that night. The men needed to move camp as the current one was wet and muddy. The new one would require a half-mile walk through the jungle. Roosevelt was incredibly weak, his temperature stabilizing at 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, he refused to be carried. A chair was brought alongside him so he could rest if needed. Now, on this day, the luck of the expedition began to change. Firstly, Kermit and Cherry were able to kill 3 large woolly monkeys, as well as a large turtle. Everyone was pleased to have fresh meat. In addition to this, Kermit would hike downstream to try and see what awaited them on the river. To his surprise, he saw that the hills were beginning to end. This was the news that they so desperately needed. However, everyone was cautious to believe it, as they had been disappointed before. The fresh meat and positive report from Kermit bolstered the spirits of everyone. The next morning, April 6th, the expedition got moving downriver. And before long, they observed a change they had not seen in weeks. The river widened and the waters calmed. There were no rapids or waterfalls to be seen, just a flat highway through the jungle, which was exactly what they needed. Finally, they could make progress. However, the day would bring an encounter with a familiar, albeit unwelcome face. As the canoes floated downstream, a voice cried out to them from the riverbank. Rondon looked up to see the dark figure of Julio the thief, holding onto a tree. The cursed camarada was in an awful condition, having spent 3 nights alone in the jungle with no food. He called out to them, begging for mercy and asking them to pick him up. If he expected compassion from Rondon, he was dead wrong. The Brazilian colonel coldly responded, quote, "It is not possible for me to stop the canoe now," end quote, and carried on, leaving the desperate Julio stranded along the riverbank. The 3 boats that followed gave him the same reaction. The camaradas would not even look in the direction of their cursed brother. Roosevelt peered at the man with no hint of emotion. No doubt he wished he could grab a rifle and put him out of his misery there and then. 7 miles later, they came to a large tributary that flowed into the River of Doubt and decided to camp at the intersection for the night. It had been their best day on the river in weeks, having made about 22 miles of progress. However, the fevers of both Kermit and Roosevelt heightened, leaving both men feeling weak. It was here that Rondon threw a curveball into the plan. He announced that he intended on sending men out to go back and find Julio the next day, saying that it was his duty as a Brazilian officer to bring the murderer back to civilization to face trial. Roosevelt and the Americans were outraged at the idea. The expedition could not afford to waste time while food was so low. To do so would endanger all their lives, argued Roosevelt. The problem was that there were hidden motives at play. Roosevelt and Kermit fully believed that Rondon wanted to waste a day trying to find Julio, just so it would give him time to survey the tributary that they were camped next to. Remember, Rondon had tried to pull a similar trick before, when he had secretly ordered the camaradas to slow down the construction of the canoes. Well, the argument that followed was the biggest the men had participated in during their journey. Neither Roosevelt or Rondon would back down, and it left a bitter taste over the successful day. Rondon would later write, quote, "The clash was tremendous," end quote. Roosevelt insisted over and over that Julio should be left to his fate and they should move on. But ultimately, it was not his decision to make. After all, Julio was Rondon's man. He was his soldier. That gave Rondon superior responsibility. So on April 7th, the Americans stewed as Rondon sent men upstream to locate the criminal. And just as predicted, Rondon and Lyra spent the day surveying the new tributary. Rondon justified it by writing, quote, "We took the greatest advantage possible of the stoppage which had been imposed upon us," end quote. I think that right there gives away his true intentions. On the positive side, one of the camaradas caught a large catfish, which measured about 3 feet long, and the men were surprised with how delicious it tasted. Later that evening, the men that had been sent to find Giulio stumbled into camp. They were exhausted and hungry, but alone. They had searched all day for the killer, even firing their rifles and building fires to attract his attention. But he was nowhere to be seen, eaten by the jungle. So what did happen to Giulio? Well, the expedition concluded that he had probably decided to try his luck with the Indians instead of starving to death. But even if he had lived long enough to find one of their villages, it was more than likely the natives would have just killed him. The tribes did not protect the weak or vulnerable, and especially outsiders. By the way, take this with a pinch of salt, but there is an account that comes from an English engineer that years later was one of the first people to successfully contact the Cintralaga tribe. The tribe told him of a time another stranger had come to their village who was starving to death and who fit the description of Giulio. He had nothing on him but a knife, so offered it to the natives in exchange for food. As he ate, one of the Indians walked up behind him and slit his throat with the knife. That's it. Goodbye, Giulio. The expedition returned to the river on April 8th, but despite everyone's wishful thinking at having escaped the hills, they soon encountered rapids. They weren't particularly dangerous, but they did require short portages, which slowed progress. The next 3 days would be the same. They would enjoy a smooth mile or two down the river before rapids appeared, and they had to portage the gear around. Their remaining food was almost gone, and the men were barely eating enough to stay alive, never mind fueling them for the physical work. That night, George Cherry wrote that his dinner consisted of 1 cracker, a few bites of fish, and a cup of coffee. The camaradas were faring the worst, and the officers tried to share with them, but really the small bites only stirred their stomachs even more. The lack of food was slowing their progress more, as the men had to take frequent breaks. 2 of the camaradas were so ill that the doctor thought they would die soon. Others had been battling dysentery for weeks. While the main symptom of dysentery is diarrhea, it also can make a man shiver with fever and have terrible stomach pain, as well as body aches and even delirium. One of the biggest dangers is severe dehydration, which can lead to death. Roosevelt remained one of the sickest members of the group, and the man was struggling to keep any food down at all. The result was that he had lost over 50 pounds of body weight and was incredibly weak. He could no longer sit up in the canoes. Instead, he lied on a pile of food ration tins that was covered by a muddy canvas sheet, kind of like a makeshift tent. The doctor, Cajazera, knew that if Theodore did not get help soon, he would die. His leg had developed a bacterial infection that was spreading. If left untreated, it could lead to blood poisoning, which would be deadly. By the way, the best defense would have been an antibiotic, such as penicillin, but that would not be discovered for another 14 years. The doctor wanted to operate on Roosevelt's leg, but Theodore refused. He thought the risk of further infection by operating without sterile tools in the wet tropical environment was too great. Kermit was also in a bad way. While the young man put on a brave face and refused to complain, much like his father, the truth is he had been battling malaria for weeks, and his fever was so bad at times he could barely stand. All the men were covered in insect bites, dirty, and their clothes were torn or rotting away. They were gaunt and feeble. Their beards had grown out and their skin was burnt. They would have made quite the sight. By this point, the men had traversed approximately 200 miles of the River of Doubt. The river had followed a northerly course, which meant there were 2 possible destinations for where they would end up. The first was the Madeira River, which was 800 miles north of their position. If that was the case, they still had a long way to go, 4 times what they had already done. That would be impossible. The second option was the Aripuana River, which was close by to the east. If the River of Doubt led them in that direction, they were a lot closer to a known position. If that second option was true, then in around 200 miles they would reach a fork in the river where they were hoping to meet the team, led by Lieutenant Piranese, the man Rondon has sent up the Aripuana River to act as their relief force. This forward thinking from Rondon was their only lifeline. If Lieutenant Pyrenees was waiting there with fresh supplies, it would likely save their lives. Of course, there was a chance that Rondon's relief team would not be at the meeting point. Any number of fates could have befallen them. They all knew how dangerous this jungle was, but nobody wanted to think about that. In any case, cracks were beginning to show in the expedition's morale. George Cherry discovered that a box of ammunition for his rifle had been stolen. It was clear that the thief had thought the box might contain food. Cherry was annoyed that his gun was now useless, but more than that, it showed how desperate the camaradas were becoming. No one could blame Julio this time. By the way, even Rondon admitted that his men were in bad shape, but insisted that mentally they were as strong as ever. The Brazilian commander had a habit of projecting his own toughness and fortitude on his men. It should be remembered that Rondon had grown up in the forest. The jungle was the only home he had ever known. It didn't grate on him as much as the others. But there's also no denying that Rondon was a force of nature. He fared better than everyone in the difficult environment, never seemingly suffering from exhaustion or sickness. He was a machine. On April 10th, the men were setting off in their boats, when suddenly Kermit's dog, named Chiguero, jumped off the canoe and wandered into the forest. Now Chiguero was Kermit's favourite dog, and had been with him ever since the start of the expedition. The young Roosevelt was very fond of his four-legged companion, even mentioning the animal in his letters to Belle. But Kermit was so sick with malaria that he didn't notice Chiguero wander off. By the time he did notice, the canoes were already split up, and they were a few miles downstream. That evening, when they made camp, Kermit told Rondon, and the Brazilian agreed that the next day he would send some men back to retrieve the animal. George Cherry was appalled at this decision, and openly criticized his fellow Americans in his diary, writing, quote, "I feel this was a great mistake on Colonel Roosevelt and Kermit's part when we are so anxious to get ahead." End quote. Cherry's frustration would grow all day, until finally the camaradas stepped back into camp with Chiguero by their side, as the sun was setting. They had wasted an entire day searching for the animal. However, the delay had also provided some very good news. While waiting for the men to return, one of the camaradas had gone fishing along the opposite side of the river. It was there that he spotted a vine that had, without question, been cut off with an axe. Now, Indians did not possess metal tools, so this left one culprit: rubber tappers. A rubber tapper was a person who harvests latex, a kind of milky sap, from the rubber tree. They would make cuts into the trunk of the tree and then collect the sap that dripped from the incision. This was good news for a few reasons. Most importantly, it was the first sign of the outside world that the men had encountered on the river. But before we move on, I'm going to give you some quick background on rubber and the rubber tappers. Rubber was a huge industry in Brazil. When Henry Ford began manufacturing the Model T in 1908, the Amazon was the world's sole producer of this magical material. As the popularity of automobiles grew, it resulted in a gigantic demand for rubber. It rivaled the California gold rush. Now, strangely, in Brazil, very little effort had been made to cultivate rubber trees efficiently, like in a plantation or something like that. This meant that to harvest rubber, people had to go to where the trees were, which was in the Amazon basin. Thousands of men, young and old, travelled into the jungle to seek their fortune. These were true pioneers, because in order to find untapped trees and a plot of land they could claim, they had to venture deeper and deeper into the jungle. By the time Roosevelt was on the River of Doubt, the rubber tappers had become the people who lived furthest from the edge of civilization. Now, being a rubber tapper was a difficult, lonely life. They lived in small huts and would survive off a tiny subsistence garden. These people were desperately poor, living under the harshest of conditions. The dangers the expedition had faced on the river was just daily life for a rubber tapper. The death rate was exceedingly high. It was a profession that only attracted the most desperate of people. They had to spend pretty much every day alone in the jungle. It could take weeks of hard work to produce a single ball of rubber that weighed between 60 and 150 pounds, which was then heavy enough to be sold. So that was the life of a rubber tapper in the Amazon basin, and the expedition had just seen the first sign of these jungle pioneers. The men felt wary, but hopeful at seeing signs of other human beings for the first time in months. They were apprehensive because rubber tappers were a lawless bunch, and they were approaching them from upstream. The rubber tappers that lived on the River of Doubt would never have seen any people emerge from that direction. and I mean ever. Upstream was where the Indians lived. If the rubber tappers felt threatened by the sight of the expedition, they might take it upon themselves to attack first. Anyway, days passed and there were no other signs of rubber tappers until finally on April 15th, something was spotted on the left bank of the river. They pulled closer and saw a rough plank of wood staked into the ground. Burned on either side were the initials J.A. An hour later, the men spotted a simple house on the shore. It was tiny and made of a palm thatch. Next to it was an even smaller hut. The men knew this was not the work of Indians. These were the rubber tappers. The men shouted out, excited by their first contact with the outside world in months. Then they pulled over and looked inside. Nobody was home, but neither was it abandoned. There was food stored, which teased the men immensely. However, Rondon forbade anyone from taking it, despite their great hunger. The expedition moved on down the river, anxious at what they might discover next. Soon they saw something that they hadn't seen on the River of Doubt all this time. Little more than a mile after the hut, a canoe appeared on the river ahead of them, which was piloted by a single man. However, as soon as the man spotted the 4 canoes coming from upstream, he quickly paddled to shore, clearly afraid for his life. Rondon jumped up in his canoe and waved his hat like a flag to get the man's attention. He shouted his friendly intentions and reassured him they were not Indians. Luckily, the man stopped from running into the forest and listened. After a few minutes of Rondon explaining who they were, he got back in his canoe and paddled over to the expedition's boats. The man's name was Raimundo Jose Marquez, and he was a rubber tapper that lived alone on the River of Doubt. He explained to them why he was fearful. He had never seen anyone come from upriver. And let's not forget, the men of the expedition looked hardly human at this point. Roosevelt was so sick that he could not sit up to greet the rubber tapper. But despite Theodore's condition, Marquez was astounded when they told him that lying in that canoe was a former president of the United States. I mean, here was an old, extremely poor man trying to eke out a hard living in the Amazon basin, and he runs into somebody who used to be the leader of the most powerful nation on earth. What a meeting of worlds that is. When Rondon explained to Marquez that Theodore wasn't currently the president, but used to be, the tapper replied, quote, "Ah, he who has once been a king has always the right to majesty," end quote. The rubber tapper then explained that he was so poor he had no food to share, but he did give the expedition some advice. Downstream they would meet others, and that they should signal their peaceful intentions by firing one of their guns 3 times in a row and blowing on a bamboo horn that he gifted them. The expedition thanked him, the first outside human being they had seen in months, and moved on. It was not long before they came across another house. This one had 2 children outside playing, and smoke was billowing from a makeshift chimney. Before Rondon could fire his rifle and blow the horn, the children noticed the canoes and ran into the house. A moment later, a woman stepped out, who was clearly their mother. Hoping to reassure her before she panicked, Rondon fired his rifle and blew the horn, but unfortunately it did not have the desired effect. Mistaking the expedition for Indians out for blood, the woman scooped up her children and fled down the riverbank. The men tried to reassure her by calling out, but she was terrified. They watched as she fell over in the mud before picking herself up and continuing to run. She ran to some nearby houses and warned the other rubber tappers that the day had finally come and the Indians were attacking. Shocked, they all grabbed their weapons and prepared to fight, quite possibly to the death. But their leader, a man called Honorato, sensed something was wrong, and as they got closer to the expedition, he realized they were not Indians. After a tense moment, the sides shared greetings. Of course, Honorato was shocked to find Roosevelt and Brazil's greatest explorer standing outside his humble home. The rubber tappers were friendly and hospitable. They agreed to sell the expedition's supplies and 2 large canoes. This was a blessing for the exhausted camaradas. But more than that, the rubber tappers erased the final mysteries of the River of Doubt. They told them exactly where they were. The river flowed north before turning east, meeting up with the Aripuana River. This meant the River of Doubt was around 500 miles long. There was still some major rapids coming up on the lower part of the river, which meant that few people made it up this far. It was just a handful of the most ambitious rubber tappers that had formed a small community here deep in the wild. And so, with that information, the mystery of the River of Doubt had been revealed. To summarize, it was a western tributary of the Aripuana River. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "It was astonishing when we were on a river about the size of the Upper Rhine to realise that no geographer had any idea of its existence." End quote. It's hard to explain how happy the men were to have found other human beings and to hear their voices. They had been at the brink of despair. George Cherry was stirred at the simple sight of seeing chickens roam around the rubber tapper's hut. It was a simple reminder of civilization and of home. After the best meal the men had eaten in weeks, Cherry and Kermit broke out a bottle of scotch that they'd been saving the entire time with great care. As they drank, they stared up at the starry jungle sky. Now, while the expedition finally enjoyed some relief, that's not to say that everyone, or everything, was fine. Half the camaradas were so ill with fever that they couldn't work. The ones that could work were despondent and appeared lifeless. Just 2 days ago, the hunger had become too much, and so the camaradas had eaten some unidentified nuts, and many of them were now sick from some sort of poisoning. The Americans were no better. Kermit and Cherry were fighting malaria and dysentery, but no one was in worse shape than Roosevelt. He was by far the sickest man in the expedition. He continued to carry on for Kermit's sake, but there were no illusions as to how serious his condition was. He continued to tell the men to leave him if he became too great a burden. Speaking to the doctor, he said, quote, "If I am to go, it's all right. You see that the others don't stop for me. I have the shortest span of life ahead of any in the party. If anyone is to die here, I must be the one." End quote. In fact, Roosevelt's pain became so bad that on April 16th, he finally allowed the doctor to operate on his leg. They conducted the operation on the muddy soil of the riverbank. There was no anaesthetic. Ultimately, the doctor cut deep into Roosevelt's leg and drained a large infected abscess that had formed. Other men stood next to the doctor to beat away the insects that were attracted to the pus and blood pouring out of Roosevelt's leg. It is said that Theodore did not cry out in pain once. He stoically endured the procedure without complaint. Kermit would later write, quote, "Father's courage was an inspiration never to be forgotten by any of us." End quote. I will add here that Colonel Rondon was the only man in the expedition who appeared to be unaffected by their journey. The man was a different grade. Anyway, what was next? Well, the rubber tappers said that it would take them another 15 days of travelling downstream to reach the point where Rondon had posted the relief force led by Lieutenant Pyrenees. If the men could get there, then they would not be far away from getting serious help for Roosevelt, but time was ticking. The good news was that they would be passing through territory occupied by the rubber tappers, which should enable them to buy food and help if needed. So the expedition continued downstream, their spirits bolstered, but not out of the woods yet. From the reports of the tappers, there would be that final set of rapids to overcome too. The river was still dangerous. Further downstream, they had a stroke of luck upon meeting a rubber tapper named Barbosa. The man lived with his wife and many children in a tiny hut. Despite the striking poverty of the family, Barbosa offered the expedition a duck, a chicken, and 6 pounds of rice, all free of charge. He then lent them his boat, which was his most valuable possession, in exchange for one of their poor dugouts. The men were overwhelmed with his generosity, despite the poor conditions he lived in. Further on, they were able to acquire another boat from a tapper, but also a guide. Things were looking up. They had everything they needed, they just had to get moving. Worryingly, although the men now had food to eat, Roosevelt ate very little. The man had lost a quarter of his original body weight, and his clothes hung off him awkwardly. The journey had stripped years off his life, but he kept going, refusing to break down entirely. At one point, they found a broken down river store which contained luxuries like sugar and condensed milk. The camaradas went wild, paying exorbitant prices for the items. Rondon tried to restrain his men, but there wasn't much he could do. The result was that the camaradas overate, and their bodies weren't used to the rich food. Many became sick as a result of their feasting. The team eventually came to a long series of rapids, including 6 waterfalls. It was as menacing as any they had faced. Rondon estimated it would take around 2 weeks to overcome the obstacle. The issue was, Roosevelt would not survive another 2 weeks. They needed help. But Lady Luck would show up again, right when she was needed. At the top of the rapids, they met a man named Jose Carip, who was the king of the rubber tappers. The man was essentially the boss of the local area. The rubber tappers who lived on this stretch of the river worked for him, giving him rubber in exchange for tools and provisions. Jose Carip was exactly what the expedition needed. The man had started life as poor as could be, but had worked relentlessly until he now enjoyed a position of relative wealth and power. He was tough, smart, and as invincible as Rondon. When he heard that the expedition was going to attempt the rapids, he took one look at the condition of Roosevelt and shook his head. To help them, he proposed that he would guide them through the worst of it. The expedition was thrilled to have a guide, as it would save them a lot of trouble. Carripe also gave them one of his well-made boats. So the expedition set off, and with their new guide, they made quick progress. Jose Carripe seemed to know exactly where to go, and where not to go, effortlessly guiding them through the rapids. When they had no choice but to portage the equipment, he revealed hidden trails that were already cut through the jungle. The waterfalls still demanded several difficult portages, but in the end, they made it through. The expedition did lose one member of the team, Kermit's dog, Chiguero, who wandered off one day into the jungle, never to be seen again. Kermit was gutted to have lost his companion so close to the end, but at the same time, he had bigger worries. His father's life hung in the balance every day. At the end of the rapids, they bid farewell to Carripe and continued on. And that brings us to April 26th. The men had passed through a stretch of the forest that was partially submerged when they rounded a bend in the river and were met with an amazing sight. They saw a line of tents dotted along the riverbank. In the middle of the camp, they spotted the familiar face of Lieutenant Pyrenees and his relief team. They had made it. Shouts of joy rang out from the canoes as they saw each other. The men fired their rifles into the sky in excitement. Lying in the canoe, Roosevelt pulled himself up with his weak arms and gazed at the rescuers. He saw the tents and the men, but his eyes were fixated on two flags that were flying against the sharp blue sky. One was the strong green, gold and blue of Rondon's beloved Brazil, and fluttering beside it was the red, white and blue stars and stripes, the country that Roosevelt had given his life to and that he had thought he would never see again. It must have been quite the sight. Finally, they had conquered the River of Doubt. Now, to round things out, I'm going to discuss the aftermath and legacy of the expedition and the men involved. In the end, their journey was nothing short of remarkable. Against the odds, they had succeeded. They had mapped a previously unknown 500-mile-long river deep in the heart of South America. It may not have been the 1,000-mile giant some had hoped for, but it was still a major discovery and a significant addition to the geographical record. And frankly, had the river been any longer, survival would have been impossible. Of the 19 men who had set out from the river's headwaters, 16 had emerged alive. The men slept one final night on the riverbank of the River of Doubt. Then the next morning, Colonel Rondon and Lieutenant Lyra departed from the expedition. They were moving on to conduct survey work of the river. As always, Rondon was only thinking of his work. The remaining men embarked on one last canoe journey, paddling for about 4 hours until they reached a small village. There, they boarded a river steamer that was scheduled to leave the next day. It carried them down the full length of the Aripuana River, then into the Madeira, and finally to the mighty Amazon River itself, until they reached the city of Manaus. It was there that Roosevelt gathered the camaradas to personally thank them. As a token of his gratitude, he gave each man 2 gold coins. It was a quiet but deeply meaningful gesture from a man who knew just how much he owed them. Roosevelt, still dangerously ill, boarded another steamer bound for Brazil's east coast. He was carried aboard on a stretcher, thin, pale, and barely able to speak. At the port of Belém, near the mouth of the Amazon, Roosevelt transferred to an ocean steamer that would take him home to New York. There, Colonel Rondon, Lieutenant Lyra, and the Dr. Cajazera caught up with the Americans for one final farewell. It was the last time Roosevelt and Rondon would ever see each other. After all they had endured together, even the stoic Rondon must have felt the weight of that moment. By then, Roosevelt had regained a bit of strength. He was able to walk the deck of the ship, and he read voraciously in his cabin, catching up on the world events he had missed the past few months. He began eating again and put on some weight, but remained thin and gaunt, and he walked with a limp that would never fully fade. On May 19th, 1914, Theodore Roosevelt sailed into New York Harbor. Thousands gathered to welcome him home. Many had feared he had died in the jungle. The return of the former president was cause for celebration, but as reporters observed, The man who stepped ashore was no longer the invincible Rough Rider. He had lost something of his legendary vitality, and he would never be quite the same again. Now, it's worth mentioning that Roosevelt's return wasn't met with universal applause. Some controversy began to stir around the expedition. A number of skeptics doubted the truth of his claims. Some even accused him of exaggerating, or worse, fabricating parts of the journey altogether. Among the loudest critics were two well-known explorers, Sir Clements Markham and Henry Savage Landor. They openly dismissed Roosevelt's account and essentially called him a liar. But as you can imagine, Theodore Roosevelt was not the kind of man to take being accused of lying, especially after everything he'd endured. So just 1 week after returning to the United States, Roosevelt arranged a public presentation in Washington, D.C. His health was still poor, but his determination to defend his honor was unwavering. He secured the largest venue he could find, a hall with 5,000 seats, and not a single one was left empty. Roosevelt took to the stage alongside his fellow expedition members, Anthony Fiala, George Cherry, and even Father Zam. His voice was weak and he struggled to catch his breath at times, but the audience was with him. The crowd listened intently as he laid out the details of the expedition, supporting his story with maps, photos, and eyewitness testimony. In the end, Roosevelt's efforts paid off. His passion and conviction won the crowd and the press over. The New York Evening Journal wrote, quote, "Any doubts that still linger about the River of Doubt are hardly justified," end quote. And as a final note, decades later, in 1992, a modern expedition was organized to retrace Roosevelt's path. It included 20 people, among them Roosevelt's great-grandson, Tweed Roosevelt. They confirmed everything he had reported. The river was very much real, and the journey had happened. Once again, Roosevelt's story stood the test of time. Now, I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of the members of the expedition and how their stories ended. Anthony Fiala, the failed quartermaster, had his own moment of triumph. After being dismissed from the main expedition, he successfully navigated the length of the Papagayo River, something that had never been done before. The achievement lifted a weight off his shoulders. Fiala would later serve in World War I, but he never returned to exploring. He passed away in 1950. Next is Father Zam, the priest who originally organized the entire expedition. As you might recall, Zam was sent home before the River of Doubt was even reached, due to his poor health and a less than ideal attitude. Despite that somewhat embarrassing exit, Roosevelt made an effort to preserve their relationship. In fact, he even invited Zam on stage during his big Washington presentation, allowing him to share in the glory. Zam returned to Notre Dame, where he continued his work as a professor. And while he didn't contribute much to the expedition itself, it's worth noting that he was a respected scientist who did meaningful work for the university. He died in 1921 at the age of 70. Now onto one of my favourite members of the expedition, George Cherry. Cherry went on to continue his work in South America before eventually retiring to a quiet farm in Vermont. He passed away in 1948 at the age of 83. Over the course of his life, he collected more than 100,000 birds for scientific study, a staggering contribution to natural history. Then there's Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit's post-expedition life was tragically far more turbulent. While on the River of Doubt, he dreamed of marrying Belle Ward, and he did. He served with distinction in World War I, but he struggled with deep bouts of depression and began to drink heavily. Despite flashes of brilliance, Kermit never found a lasting sense of purpose. In the 1930s, he struggled with his finances and his drinking worsened. At one point, his own brother had him committed to a sanitarium against his will. During World War II, Kermit joined the British Army and was injured while fighting in Norway. But the demons never left him. On June 4th, 1943, Kermit took his own life. A heartbreaking end to a life filled with promise. Now let's turn to the Brazilian members of the expedition. Lieutenant Lyra met a tragic fate just 3 years after the journey. While surveying the Sebatuba River, he drowned. His final act was reportedly tossing his surveying notebook to shore to preserve his findings even as he drowned. And then there's the man who frankly doesn't get nearly enough recognition, Candido Rondon. I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of him before researching this story, but now I can't help but admire him. Rondon was as tough as they came, and his contributions to science, exploration, and the rights of the indigenous people were remarkable. Born into poverty, he rose through the ranks of the military through sheer willpower and intelligence. During the River of Doubt expedition, he was the only member who never got sick or injured. Roosevelt himself called Rondon one of the greatest living explorers. Rondon continued to serve his country after the expedition. He led military forces during a rebellion in Sao Paulo in the 1920s and surveyed vast areas of the Amazon and championed the rights of Brazil's indigenous people with kindness and respect. In 1955, at the age of 90, he was awarded the title of Marshal of the Brazilian Army. He was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Albert Einstein, who met Rondon during a visit to Brazil. Rondon died in 1958 in Rio de Janeiro at the age of 92. His legacy is immense. He explored more of the Amazon than anyone in history, earned the title of Father of Telecommunications in Brazil, and even had a state, Rondonia, named in his honor. May 5th is still celebrated in Brazil as the National Day of Telecommunications because of him. But his most powerful legacy is the way he treated indigenous communities, with empathy, humility, and respect. Finally, we come to the man himself, Theodore Roosevelt. To put it bluntly, Roosevelt never fully recovered from the expedition. His legendary stamina was gone. He was hospitalized multiple times in the years that followed. Yet his passion for service and action never faded. When the United States entered World War I, Roosevelt wanted to raise a volunteer regiment and go and fight. Classic Theodore. But President Woodrow Wilson denied the request. Wilson, wary of Roosevelt's enduring popularity, likely feared he'd return a war hero yet again. Roosevelt was deeply bitter over the refusal and wanted nothing more than to go and fight for his country. In 1918, his health deteriorated significantly. He spent 7 weeks in the hospital. Then, in July, tragedy struck. His youngest son, Quinton, who was a pilot in World War I, was shot down and killed in action. Roosevelt was devastated. Though he had always imagined himself dying gloriously in battle, he had never wished that fate upon his children. Quinton's death broke something in him. On January 5th, 1919, Roosevelt began having breathing problems. In the early hours of the next day, he died from a blood clot at the age of 60. It's hard not to like Theodore Roosevelt. He feels like a character lifted from the pages of a novel, larger than life, full of contradictions, but deeply human. He wasn't perfect, but he gave everything he had to the causes he believed in. His determination, his energy, and his willingness to dive headfirst into the unknown remain legendary. Roosevelt truly tried to wring every last drop from life. So there we have it. I really hope you enjoyed this story. It is one of my favourites, and I really wanted to do it justice. Please subscribe to my channel if you are interested in more stories from the great explorers. I spent a lot of time on this video researching, writing, and editing, so I'd really appreciate any support you can give. I hope you are well wherever you are, and until next time, goodbye.